Hey everyone, welcome to another exciting adventure. Today, Audio Novel presents, A Science Journey, by SenatusAlpha. Wait, don't forget, supporting authors like SenatusAlpha is what keeps these amazing stories alive. Show some love for their incredible work. Author's Patreon link in description. And if you're looking for more amazing stories, don't forget to check out my Patreon page. Your support helps turn incredible tales like this one into fully immersive audiobooks. Join me on this journey, and together, we can bring more stories to life. Thank you for being part of the adventure. Let's begin. Chapter 1, Infinite Terror VR Game. The lesson for today is over, everyone can go back now, and remember to finish your homework. Standing at the lectern, Shizuka Hiratsuka had gathered her teaching materials and was ready to leave the classroom, addressing the students below as they started to get noisy. Those of you in clubs, make sure to study as well, exams are just a few days away. Seeing that many students were getting even more restless, Shizuka Hiratsuka added another reminder, making the students who had already been about to leave groan with disappointment. In this country that values joyful education, there are many students who struggle with studying, and failing exams is a tall barrier in front of them. For many students who had just been energized by club activities, their spirits were quickly dampened by Shizuka's words. "Come on, Hiratsuka-sensei, don't rain on our parade like that." "Yeah, I was just planning to show off my ball skills to my juniors today, but now I'm totally unmotivated." Complaints from the students immediately echoed around the classroom, but Shizuka Hiratsuka only gave them a glance and left them with one final comment. "Anyone who fails this exam will have to attend weekend classes." This remark carried weight, and the classroom fell even quieter. Not that Shizuka minded, making these normally less diligent students feel a little urgency was a good thing. Gathering her materials, she left the classroom. Sitting by the window in the second-to-last row, Shin observed this and began packing up his books and bag, ready to go home. Unlike other students, Shin wasn't in any clubs and was a proud member of the Go Home Club, so he wasn't in Hiratsuka's line of fire. "Shin, heading home already? Want to go to karaoke with us? The class next door will be there too, and I heard they invited Senpai Kasumigakaka." Noticing that Shin was getting ready to leave, a boy next to him came up with a grin and extended the invitation. This might be a rare chance to hang out with Senpai Kasumigakaka. "Are you sure you don't want to come?" The Kasumigakaka senpai, he mentioned, was Yutaha Kasumigakaka, a well-known beauty at this private Toyosaki high school. Tall, with a lovely face, sleek, long black hair, and consistently ranking first in her grade, she was often the talk of the school. However, Kasumigakaka seemed uninterested in others, absorbed in her own world. Many tried to approach her but failed. So it was no surprise the boy called this a rare chance to hang out with Senpai Kasumigakaka. But Shin had no intention of accepting. He shook his head and, smiling like an ordinary student, politely declined. "No, I have a few things to take care of. Maybe next time." "Really? Well, that's a shame." The boy looked a bit disappointed, seemingly regretting Shin's refusal. After all, Shin was also quite good-looking. Although he wasn't well known at school since he tended to keep a low profile, his looks had garnered him confessions from several girls. Yet Shin seemed uninterested in relationships, as though something was holding him back, and he had always gently turned down those girls. "Well, then, I'll head out first." Shin picked up his bag, waved to the boy, and left the classroom without looking back. To be honest, he didn't have much faith in the boy's claim that Kasumigakaka would be there. Kasumigakaka wasn't the type to go to karaoke with her classmates. But he hadn't directly said this, since that might have seemed a bit rude. For now, Shin preferred to live under the radar. Although his appearance attracted some attention, his life was generally quite ordinary, academically above average, decent in sports. However, this normalcy probably wouldn't last much longer. Tonight, he would likely experience a life-changing shift. Walking briskly back to his rented apartment, Shin threw his bag in the corner of his room and sat down on his bed, trying to calm his excitement, and silently thought. System, activate. Yes, Shin wasn't an ordinary person. He was a transmigrant who had mysteriously arrived in this world about 2 years ago, becoming a middle school student. Though he was in his own body, he somehow reverted to a younger age and gained the status of an orphan, which had baffled him. Along with his arrival came a countdown in his mind, a system set to activate in 2.5 years. So, for 2.5 years, Shin had been playing the part of an average student. 6 months ago, he graduated middle school and enrolled in Toyosaki High. Only then did he realize what kind of world he was in, a world blending many anime characters he had once seen, with familiar names circulating around the school. However, despite the presence of characters he'd only seen in anime, he hadn't taken any impulsive actions. With the system set to activate soon, he wanted to understand it first. If it turned out to be something apocalyptic, things could get serious. Shin hadn't found any Apocalypse Academy on this world's internet, but he couldn't rule out the possibility of apocalyptic elements lurking around. After all, even Yukino appeared at Toyosaki, suggesting that characters and settings could migrate to different schools, even if the original ones didn't exist. So Shin was both excited and anxious. If this system were linked to an apocalyptic scenario, the world could be more dangerous than it seemed. Hopefully, the system would be relatively low risk. Alright, let's see what kind of system it is. As Shin's anticipation grew, the system he had waited 2.5 years for finally revealed itself, and a cold, emotionless voice sounded in his mind. Welcome to the Infinite Terror VR game. Please enter your username. To be continued. Chapter 2, Dragon Ball World, Saiyan. Infinite Horror. VR game. Shin was momentarily stunned. He hadn't expected that after waiting for 2.5 years, the system that finally activated would actually call itself a game. He knew of Infinite Horror. It was a web novel he'd read in his previous life. The novel revolved around the concept of completing missions by traveling across different worlds, sparking a whole genre known as the Infinity Stream. More importantly, in novels of this genre, the protagonists usually traveled across these worlds as part of a team, not alone. Could it be that I'm not the only player in this Infinite Horror VR game? Scratching his head, Shin hesitated. To be on the safe side, he didn't use his real name for his username. Let's go with Zuke as my username. Checking username. Username not taken. Welcome to the game, Zuke. You are the only player in this world. Enjoy your game. Please confirm the user agreement. It really is a game, huh? Though there was nothing visible in front of him, Shin felt a flood of text pour into his mind. It was undoubtedly the user agreement. Just like in games where you're expected to read pages of terms and check the box by I agree, most players would usually skip through and check the box blindly. But this time was different. The terms were directly implanted in his mind, so Shin took the time to read through them carefully, finally confirming one thing. The terms were exactly like any standard online game user agreement. With a mix of amusement and exasperation, Shin agreed to the user agreement. Instantly, he felt a slight tremor, as if something had fused into his body. Dear Zuke, your game is the dream version. Please start the game after entering sleep. In-game, your body and mind will still recover. So this thing takes up my sleep time, huh? Shin mused, realizing he didn't need to worry about setting aside time to play if it only occupied his sleeping hours. With this in mind, he quickly got ready, heading to the bathroom to wash up, a basic bedtime routine he always followed. Afterward, Shin put on his pajamas, got under the covers, and prepared to sleep. Though it wasn't even 7 p.m. yet, his eagerness to dive into this Infinite Horror VR game overrode any concern about sleeping too early. Even if it called itself a game, the system had followed him to this world, so Shin doubted it was purely for entertainment. With such thoughts, he calmed himself, gradually slipping into sleep. Soon, as his consciousness blurred, he opened his eyes once more. Transitioning to Zuke now. This time, however, he found himself not lying on his bed, but floating in a pool of liquid. What's going on? Why am I in water? Instinctively, Zuke struggled, but he quickly noticed that, despite being submerged, he could still breathe. This liquid, although it filled his nose, didn't cause suffocation. Instead, it made him feel strangely comfortable. Before he could grasp the situation, a long beep sounded above him, and he felt the liquid around him drain rapidly through an outlet beneath him. As he was lowered by the receding liquid, Zuke realized he was inside some sort of strange mechanical pod, with tubes attached to his body. Just then, the pod's door opened, revealing a strange figure with a face like a frog's, holding a tablet-like device. The figure glanced at him disinterestedly and said, "Zuke, your injuries have fully healed. You can return to duty. Hearing this, Zuke instinctively stepped out of the pod, learning that he'd apparently been healing inside this chamber after sustaining injuries. Even more significant was the frog-faced alien's attire, which Zuke recognized immediately. It was the battle armor of Frisia's army. This is the Dragon Ball world, and you are currently stationed on Frisia's base. Zuke's brow furrowed as he realized his situation. It made sense that this person's face resembled a frog. Frisia's army was full of aliens with strange appearances. And from what he just said, I seem to be a combatant in Frisia's army, injured in some battle and sent to this healing pod. Turning to look at the pod behind him, Zuke now recognized it as one of Frisia's healing chambers, the very one that Vegeta had used to recover after fleeing Earth in Dragon Ball. Hurry up and put some clothes on. I have no interest in watching a shirtless man strut around, the frog-faced alien grumbled impatiently, noting that Zuke was only in shorts. Snapped back to reality, Zuke quickly spotted a fresh set of armor on a nearby table, clearly prepared for him. While he was a bit reluctant to wear armor styled after Frisia's first form, it was certainly better than staying shirtless. Zuke took the armor and put it on. This guy's attitude toward me, it seems my rank here isn't very high. Thoughts ran through his mind as Zuke recalled how the soldiers in Dragon Ball treated Vegeta with utmost respect. With a power level around 18,000, Vegeta was a small captain in Frisia's army, whereas he clearly didn't receive such treatment. Once he'd put on the armor, Zuke clenched his fist slightly, a surge of powerful energy flowed through his body, and he could feel that at full strength, he could likely shatter a planet. This wasn't an exaggeration. In the Dragon Ball universe, a power level in the hundreds was enough to destroy the moon from afar. As a member of Frisia's army, his power level was surely in the hundreds at least. As for his exact power level, he'd have to check later using Frisia's scouter. Oh, right, your tail hasn't regrown, the frog-faced alien added with a smirk as Zuke prepared to leave. But for you Saiyans, not having a tail is one less weakness, isn't it? Zuke froze, so he was a Saiyan in this world. To be continued. Chapter 3, The Dragon Balls of Planet Seral. Saiyans, the race of Son Goku, the main character in Dragon Ball, possess immense potential and a variety of transformative powers. However, the system didn't respond verbally. Instead, a screen popped up in front of Zuke, displaying information relevant to him. Current world, Dragon Ball. Main mission, defeat Frisia at 100% power. Player's power synchronization, 0%. Please advance the main mission to unlock power synchronization. No AI response, huh? Seems like it's just a program that runs on pre-written code, Zuke thought as he observed the system's silent response. But more importantly, this isn't just for entertainment. This power synchronization likely means I can bring some of my strength back into the real world. To be honest, Zuke hadn't expected to be this lucky. Right from the start, he was transported into the world of Dragon Ball. And this was Dragon Ball, after all, a universe where battles later on reach planet-shattering levels. While the original series may not have depicted it as vividly, the lore states it outright. With only a few hundred power levels, a Kamehameha wave could be launched from Earth to obliterate the moon. Imagining this, Zuke was already a little envious. The good news was that synchronizing a few hundred power levels would be easy. If Zuke's power level reached tens of thousands, then even with a 1% synchronization rate, he'd be unbeatable in the real world. Still, my power level must be nowhere near the tens of thousands right now. Once he cooled down, Zuke quickly realized the predicament he was in. As a Saiyan, I'm still alive, which means Frisia hasn't destroyed Planet Vegeta yet. So, right now, the strongest Saiyan would be King Vegeta, who likely has a power level slightly over 10,000. Vegeta once said he surpassed his father's power level as a child, which means that King Vegeta is actually far weaker than adult Vegeta. Estimating generously, Zuke guessed around 10,000 for King Vegeta. If King Vegeta's power level is just over 10,000, Zuke's must be lower. To complete the main mission of defeating Frisia at 100% power, Zuke would have to raise his power level to at least 120 million. That's no small feat. Zuke knew he'd have to plan carefully. Yo, Zuke, all healed up. Just as Zuke was mulling over his mission strategy, a voice called out to him. He turned to see a plain-looking male Saiyan approaching with a few others. Zuke didn't recognize this Saiyan, probably just a background character with no role in the original series. But he immediately recognized the man leading the group. Bardock. Indeed, it was Bardock, the father of Dragon Ball's main character. Glad you're well. Bardock walked up to Zuke and gave his shoulder a reassuring pat, showing a familiar camaraderie. Although he was a low-class warrior, Bardock was among the best of his rank and known for his calm disposition and loyalty to his comrades. Many Saiyans held him in high regard. In the ruthless Saiyan race, Bardock was a rare exception. Hey, if it were me, I'd use this chance to lounge in the healing pod a little longer, another Saiyan commented, smiling slyly. Zuke, have you heard? Frisia's given us a new mission to clear a planet called Seral. If you stayed in the pod, you wouldn't have to go. Idiot, call him Lord Frisia. Haha, right, Lord Frisia's orders. One female Saiyan playfully corrected him, and the male Saiyan chuckled in response. It was obvious the Saiyans didn't truly respect Frisia. From King Vegeta down to low-class warriors, none of them genuinely submitted to him. Although they were compelled to obey Frisia due to his power, it was clear that once the Saiyans gained the strength to resist, they would undoubtedly rise against him. It's no wonder Frisia had a constant disdain for the Saiyans and was ever eager to eliminate them along with their planet. Ignoring the playful banter, Zuke asked, Seral? Yep, apparently it's a valuable client's target, so they want to make sure nothing goes wrong and asked for us, the male Saiyan replied. They even calculated the moon's full phase. A few hours from now, Seral will enter nighttime, and the full moon will rise. So we're heading out shortly. Hearing this, Zuke's eyes gleamed. If he remembered correctly, Seral was a plot point in the Dragon Ball Super manga. What do you say, Zuke? Are you coming with us? If you're not feeling well, you can stay. Unlike the others, Bardock didn't tease him. He was one of the few Saiyans capable of calm, rational thought and genuinely cared for his comrades. It was clear that if Zuke wanted to stay behind, Bardock could arrange it. His reputation among the low-class warriors was high enough that no one would object. No, I'm nearly fully healed. I'll go. Zuke declined Bardock's offer because he absolutely wanted to go. Seral held things of immense value. He had been worrying about how to locate Earth's coordinates without drawing attention from Frisia's forces, but now, Seral would serve as a suitable alternative. After all, his main purpose in going to Earth was to find the 7 Dragon Balls and summon Shenron to grant his wish. But since Seral had Dragon Balls too, just 2 to summon its Shenron, he could settle for that. To be continued. Chapter 4, The Plan to Retrieve the Dragon Balls. Looks like your injuries have indeed healed, but your body still seems a bit stiff. Is it because your internal injuries haven't fully healed? In the open area of the Saiyan settlement, Bardock watched Zuke throw punches haphazardly with a puzzled look on his face. Zuke's face reddened. Bardock's assumption was understandable. Although Zuke had acquired the powerful combat strength of this Saiyan body, he had almost no combat experience or instincts. Just standing there throwing sloppy punches made it obvious to Bardock that something was off. In a real fight, Zuke's lack of experience would likely be even more apparent. The only thing Zuke was relieved about was that this invasion of Planet Seral coincided with a full moon. When they arrived, all the Saiyans would transform into giant, mindless apes. No one would notice that Zuke fought like a novice. But Bardock's straightforward comments made Zuke realize a problem. Even though he had strength, he had no combat technique. While he could power through on sheer strength, if he encountered an opponent of equal power, he'd be in trouble. Especially since Zuke's main mission was to kill Frisia at full strength, a monster with a power level of 120 million. Unless Zuke raised his own power level above 200 million, technique was going to be crucial. Incidentally, Zuke had just checked his own power level using a scouter. It was 4,000, putting him on par with Nappa when he arrived on Earth in the original story. In other words, Zuke now had enough power to destroy several cities with a single move. If he could sink even 1% of that strength back to his real body, a power level of just 40 would be enough to dominate any so-called world champion. Bardock. Zuke. Time to go. As Bardock was about to ask more questions, someone called for them to depart from a distance. They had to board the spherical spaceship and head for Planet Seral immediately. Bardock glanced at Zuke, sighed, and patted him on the shoulder. Anyway, if you feel any discomfort during the fight, be sure to back off immediately. Clearly, Bardock still thought Zuke hadn't fully recovered, especially after watching that embarrassing display of punches. Although Saiyans generally didn't care much about technique, relying on brute strength and their great ape transformation to overwhelm most planets, at the very least, they needed to know how to focus their power into their fists. Ahem, well, since it's a full moon on Planet Seral, we'll transform into giant apes once we arrive, so it doesn't matter. Zuke knew that his punching had been embarrassing and secretly resolved to improve his combat skills. But at least he wouldn't need them this time. During a full moon, Saiyans transform into giant apes, causing their combat strength to multiply by 10 while losing their sanity in a frenzy of destruction. This was a common Saiyan method of wiping out entire planets during invasions. Only the royal-blooded elite warriors could retain their sanity during the Great Ape transformation, but Bardock and the others obviously couldn't. The Saiyans' mission was to clear out a planet's civilization so that Frisia could sell it afterward, so preserving buildings or anything else wasn't necessary. Yeah, we'll all be turning into great apes soon. Bardock paused, then glanced at Zuke's waist, of course, not because of any strange interest but because Zuke's waist was missing something important. But don't forget, you don't have a tail, so you won't transform into a great ape. Don't get yourself trampled by your comrades. Zuke instinctively touched his waist, it was true. Saiyans needed their tails to transform, and his tail had been ripped off before he entered the world of Dragonball. So, Zuke wouldn't be transforming on Planet Seral. He'd planned for this since he wasn't going there for destruction but to grab the Dragon Balls amid the chaos. In the Dragon Ball Super manga, Granola, a survivor from Planet Seral, had wished on the Dragon Balls to become the universe's strongest warrior, surpassing Goku and Vegeta by sacrificing much of his lifespan. To be honest, when Zuke read this in the manga, he found it ridiculous. At that time, Goku and Vegeta were far stronger than when they defeated Majin Buu, yet Granola caught up just by making a wish. However, the absurdity of this storyline turning into reality was an incredible opportunity, proving that the two-star Dragon Balls could grant outrageous wishes at a certain cost. Of course, Zuke didn't plan to go as far as Granola and sacrifice his lifespan down to 3 months just for power. He wasn't sure if his power synced with his real body would disappear if this identity died, so he'd be cautious to keep this identity alive as long as possible. Zuke, catch. As Zuke contemplated what to do with the Dragon Balls, Bardock tossed something at him as they prepared to board the spaceship. Zuke caught it, a scouter. Since you won't transform, you should clear out anyone who tries to escape the cities for safety. While Bardock was genuinely considerate toward his comrades, his words were brutal to the inhabitants of Planet Seral. The scouter can detect anyone's power level. It's all yours. Zuke quietly accepted the scouter, nodded at Bardock, and climbed into the spaceship, waiting for Frisia's forces to set the coordinates. Though it was merciless, Zuke didn't plan to interfere with the Saiyan invasion. On the one hand, because the Infinite Terror VR game advertised itself as a game, Zuke instinctively viewed Dragon Ball events with a gamer's detachment. On the other hand, he was powerless. Even if he wanted to save Planet Seral's inhabitants, what could he do? He wasn't even the strongest among the Saiyans on this mission, let alone those who could transform into great apes. A mindless great ape wouldn't spare a comrade in its path. If he tried to intervene, he'd get stumped. So, Zuke had made his decision. He'd let Planet Seral and the Saiyans draw all the attention, giving him the chance to snatch the Dragon Balls. As for whether he could get hold of Planet Seral's Dragon Balls, he wasn't too worried. The 2 Dragon Balls were held by an elderly non-combat named Kean, and his 4,000 power level could easily handle it, even without technique. If the old man handed them over willingly, that would be best, if not, Zuke might have to resort to violence. Chapter 5, The Alien Named Kean. On the Planet Seral, night had fallen, and after a busy day, the Seralians walked along the streets, sharing tales of the day's achievements in a lively, thriving city. But the peaceful evening didn't last long, an unexpected disturbance came. Many Seralians soon noticed a fireball in the sky, hurtling down like a meteor toward the city's edge. Then came a second, a third, and finally, the Seralians realized what these fireballs were: spherical spacecraft, shaped like baseballs, crashing straight into the city. Boom. 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 The spherical ships crashed mercilessly into the Seralian city. Buildings crumbled under the immense impact, and many Cerealians were knocked unconscious by the shockwave of the landing. One unfortunate Cerealian was hit directly by a descending ship, dying instantly, perhaps a mercifully quick end without pain. Other Cerealians weren't so lucky, facing off against the Scions who emerged from these ships with fierce, sinister grins. Their fates would not be so painless. Seems Bardock made special arrangements for me. My landing coordinates are indeed at the city's edge, Zuke murmured as he emerged from his ship, quickly noting that his landing spot was some distance from the other Scions. While the other Scions had descended straight into the city center, his ship had landed at the outskirts, putting him entirely apart from the main forces. Bardock might seem ruthless to outsiders, but to his Scion allies, he was certainly reliable. Roar. While Zuke was assessing his surroundings, an ear-splitting roar erupted from within the city, piercing the night sky. Zuke watched as giant apes slowly stood among the city buildings, radiating fierce, savage energy, immediately beginning to destroy everything around them without mercy. TSK, such terrifying power. He put on his scouter and checked the apes' power levels. Since Scion's power levels increased tenfold when transformed into giant apes, the numbers displayed were staggering. 22,000, 41,000. 39,000, Zuke even spotted one power level close to 100,000, likely belonging to Bardock, the strongest among them. But Frisia's power level in his first form alone was a staggering 530,000. Zuke glanced up at the bright full moon in the night sky, feeling his blood stir, an instinctive Scion reaction to the full moon. However, without a tail, Zuke wouldn't transform into a giant ape, allowing him to remain rational. Plus, with Bardock's help, he'd landed on the outskirts, perfect for completing his mission. First, I'll search for any combat power signals outside the Cerealians and Scions. By adjusting his scouter, Zuke quickly filtered out the power readings of the Scions and Cerealians, leaving only a handful of unique signals on the detector. These signals were clustered in a house on the city's edge, with the highest reading only around 300, and the weakest at a mere 5. Zuke knew these were the Namekians who had taken refuge on Serial after Namek's destruction, forming a tiny settlement. Over time, their numbers had dwindled to just a few. And if things went according to plan, most would perish in this invasion. Only one elderly Namekian would survive, guarding the 2 Dragon Balls. Now that I have their location, time to claim them. Not waiting around, Zuke quickly headed toward the location marked on the scouter. Even without flight, his high combat power made running and leaping incredibly swift. For now, Zuke was clueless about ki in this world, but with his Scion aptitude, he could probably learn to fly soon enough. Elder, we should escape while we can. The situation here on Serial looks bleak, a Namekian urged in the small house at the city's edge, where the few surviving Namekians were gathered, planning their next move. Though few in number, the group still had an elder with certain special abilities, though far weaker than the elder on Namek. It's not just the Cerealians in danger, we Namekians are too. The elder wore a pained expression as he listened to his companion's pleas. Although the Scions were mainly focused on fighting the Cerealians, where could the Namekians go? They never expected Serial to be invaded, and their old refugee ship was too worn to work again. Moreover, the Cerealians had kindly taken them in when they fled. How could they abandon them in a time of crisis? Elder, should we use the Dragon Balls, suggested an elderly Namekian, Monate, the only future survivor. The Dragon Balls. The elder lifted his gaze toward a shrine-like structure in the room, where 2 Dragon Balls rested. The Dragon Balls were indeed meant for moments like this, so. Apologies, but could you leave those Dragon Balls to me? Before the elder could finish, a figure suddenly shattered the window and jumped in. Before the stunned Namekians could react, he had blocked their path to the Dragon Balls. It was Zuke. Just as he arrived outside the house, he overheard the Namekians discussing using the Dragon Balls, and he couldn't allow that, so he broke in. The Namekians were startled and then, upon recognizing Zuke's attire, horrified. A Scion. The Scion's notorious reputation had spread to many planets, and the giant apes invading Serial were too distinctive to mistake. Everyone knew the attacker's identity. Zuke lacked a tail, but his Scion battle armor was unmistakable. He certainly wasn't a Cerealian joking around in Scion garb. To be continued. Chapter 6, The Summoning of the Shenron on Planet Seral. Curse you, Scion. Don't you dare lay a hand on the Dragon Balls. In less than a minute, only Zuke and the old name Kean, Minato, were still awake in the room. The other name Keans had already collapsed, unconscious on the ground, not because Zuke had killed them, but because he had merely knocked them all out. It wasn't that Zuke was soft-hearted, he simply needed at least one name Kean to help him summon the Shenron. The name Kean Dragon Balls require a specific incantation to be summoned. It's not as simple as Earth's Dragon Balls, where one can just say, "Come forth, Shenron," and have it appear. Zuke had long since forgotten the incantation to summon the Dragon Balls. After all, who remembers the exact words to summon Dragon Balls when reading a manga? Besides, he read it before his own reincarnation. At that time, he never imagined he'd actually get a chance to summon the Shenron in real life. "I didn't kill them, I just want to borrow the Dragon Balls." Zuke's choice to leave Minato conscious was straightforward. In the original story, Minato had a particularly timid personality, making him easier to intimidate and coax than other name Keans who were harder to read. "As long as you help me summon the Shenron, I won't kill them." "How about that? Even if you spare us, your Saiyan comrades will surely annihilate us all, won't they?" Minato furrowed his brow. Despite his weak nature, he wasn't foolish. He could still hear the sounds of chaos from the nearby city through the window. The great apes were still rampaging through the Cerealian city. Minato had heard of the Saiyan reputation. As Frisia's henchman, this brutal warrior race would destroy civilizations until nothing was left but barren, lifeless planets. Although this Saiyan before him hadn't killed his people outright, without the Dragon Ball's help, the Saiyans would eventually wipe out the remaining name Keans. Right now, their only hope of survival lay in summoning the Shenron and making a wish with the two Dragon Balls. How could he place that hope in the hands of a Saiyan enemy? "Minato, let me clarify, these two Dragon Balls are in my possession now. Even if you disagree, they won't return to you." Zuke gazed at Minato, fully expecting the old man's initial refusal. He was undoubtedly brimming with anger and lacked rationality in that moment. "But if you agree to summon the Shenron for me, I will allow you to temporarily leave this planet to take refuge. This way, at least one name Kean survivor will remain." Zuke's cold tone sent a shiver through Minato, who had been overcome with fury, bringing him back to his senses. Yes, the Dragon Balls were now in this Saiyan's hands. Even if he refused to summon the Shenron, Zuke wouldn't return the Dragon Balls to him, and the Cerealian name Keans would face annihilation. If he agreed to Zuke's terms, at least the Saiyan had promised to let one name Kean live. Although abandoning his kin filled him with guilt, he couldn't bear the thought of letting the name Kean lineage perish entirely. Do you really agree to let us go?" Now calmer, Minato looked at Zuke, his eyes trembling. If he were a young girl, the expression would seem pitiable, but as an old man, it gave Zuke chills. "I said I'd agree, so I will. Rest assured, you don't have another choice anyway." Zuke toyed with the two small Dragon Balls in his hands. Compared to Namex Dragon Balls, they were even slightly smaller than Earth's. "Also, I said I would let you go, not all of you. My spaceship can only carry one." Indeed, Zuke's plan was to send Minato away on his spherical spaceship. Frisia's army's spherical ships could set planetary coordinates and autopilot. Zuke had already set the spaceship to fly to the nearest life-sustaining planet, allowing Minato to escape to safety. As for Zuke, he wasn't worried at all. He knew he was in a dream right now, and with a few hours left of travel time, he estimated that he'd wake up soon enough. He would take this chance to make Zuke a missing person in Frisia's ranks. When Frisia's army investigated, the conclusion would be that a Saiyan named Zuke had encountered an accident during the Cerealian invasion mission, and a refugee had stolen his spaceship. This fit perfectly with the impression Zuke had left on Bardock of being still not fully recovered, explaining why he'd encountered an accident on his mission. I agree. Zuke hadn't given Minato much time to consider. He didn't even need to push him, as Minato quickly made his decision on his own. The explosions and sounds of battle outside were getting closer, indicating that the Saiyan Great Ape's destruction was expanding. It wouldn't be long before they reached the city outskirts. If Minato didn't decide quickly, a single footstep from those great apes could end his chance to make any choice at all. A wise decision. Zuke saw Minato's resigned expression, walked over, holding the two Dragon Balls in his left hand, grabbed Minato by the collar with his right, and jumped out of the building, landing on a nearby open field. The great apes and cerealians are still some distance away from here, no one else around. Perfect. On the open ground, Zuke scanned the surroundings again with his scouter, confirming that no one else was nearby. He remembered that during the Saiyan invasion of Seral, a group of alien merchants from the Heaters was observing from this planet. They were the ones who had commissioned Frisia's army for the invasion. But fortunately, none of the Heaters were around at the moment, sparing him some trouble. After all, the kid from the Heater clan, Gas, although not as strong as Frisia, was still beyond what he could handle at the moment. All right, summon the Shenron. After confirming there were no distractions, Zuke dropped the 2 Dragon Balls on the ground and turned to Minato. He wasn't worried about Minato trying to steal the Dragon Balls. With his power level barely in the double digits, he wouldn't get far. Understood. Minato closed his eyes, sighing in resignation, and extended his hands toward the 2 Dragon Balls, chanting the summoning incantation. Takaraputo Papurunga Puparito Paro. The night sky darkened further as Minato chanted, and a mysterious aura began to emanate from the 2 Dragon Balls. In the next moment, golden lightning surged from the Dragon Balls, intertwining in the air, eventually coalescing into a dragon with a face resembling that of an axolotl before Zuke. This Shenron was smaller than both the Earth and Kean dragons but still held an undeniable majesty. Facing Zuke and Minato, it slowly spoke in a deep voice. You who have gathered the 2 Dragon Balls, state your wish. I will grant you one wish to the best of my ability. To be continued. Chapter 7, The Overly Inept Shenron. The first time he witnessed Shenron being summoned in person, Zuke couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. After all, it was nothing like watching it in anime or manga. Those sky-splitting bolts of lightning were now vividly real. However, the thrill quickly faded as the dragon spoke, saying, I will do my best to fulfill one of your wishes. This phrase, do my best, instantly set it apart from other dragons. It sounded as if there were many wishes it simply couldn't fulfill and would only try to. Despite feeling slightly annoyed, Zuke kept his composure. As soon as the serial star Shenron was summoned, he delivered a swift chop to Minato's neck. Thanks to the earlier practice with those Keans inside, Zuke had now mastered the strength needed to knock someone out without causing internal injury. You. Minato looked at him, clearly stunned, as if doubting if Zuke was breaking his promise. But before he could voice his confusion, he slumped to the ground, unconscious. The blow had been perfectly measured. Don't worry, I'll keep my promise, Zuke muttered, though Minato was already out cold. The reason for knocking Minato out was to avoid him stealing a march and making a wish first, just like what happened many times in the original Dragon Ball story. Not knowing if Minato would do the same, Zuke decided this was the safest option. Afterward, all he had to do was toss Minato into a spaceship and send him off, no promises broken. The serial star Shenron required the Kean chant to be summoned, but there were no language restrictions when making wishes, a fact confirmed in the original story. Shenron, can you turn me into a Super Saiyan? Looking up at the dragon, who appeared less imposing than others, Zuke asked his question directly. Yes, becoming a Super Saiyan would be the simplest way to skyrocket his power. Transformation would multiply his combat power by 50 times, instantly raising his 4,000 power level to 200,000. Though still far below Frisia's first stage of 530,000, achieving the Super Saiyan transformation would mean every single increase in combat power thereafter would grow 50-fold. I'm sorry, but that is beyond my capabilities, the dragon replied without delay. But if you're willing to pay a price, it might be achievable, Shenron added, as he was committed to trying his best to fulfill wishes despite his limitations. In the manga, this dragon had once raised Granola, whose combat power was likely below 530,000, to the universe's top level by compressing his lifespan, a truly shocking feat. What's the price? Zuke asked, though he already had an inkling. If you compress your lifespan to 1 year, you can achieve the Super Saiyan transformation, with some additional power boost, Shenron replied. As expected, Shenron proposed sacrificing lifespan as the price, and Zuke immediately shook his head. He was certainly not about to sacrifice years of his life just for power. In truth, this secondary dragon was just one of Zuke's avenues for gaining strength. Even without this dragon, he had other options and saw no need for such a steep price. What if, after losing this Saiyan body, his synced powers vanished as well? Wouldn't that make all his efforts pointless? Can you use Dr. Gero's technology on Earth to make me an android? In Dragon Ball, the ordinary siblings became androids capable of overpowering super science after being modified by Dr. Gero. If Shenron could achieve this, it might be a valid option. After all, an android still resembled a human in every way except for the built-in energy core, a change Zuke could accept. I'm sorry, but I located Dr. Gero, and his android technology is still in its infancy. I can't apply a non-existent technology to you, Shenron replied after a pause. Right, at this time, Gero was probably still an ordinary middle-aged scientist, and Bardock's son had just been born. It would be years before Dr. Gero created Android 8, let alone Android 17 and 18. Then, can you give me the Tree of Might? After some thought, Zuke made another request, this time for the Tree of Might, which had appeared in a Dragon Ball movie. The fruit of the Tree of Might, fed by a planet's energy, could greatly boost one's combat power. If he could acquire many of these fruits, he could raise his power substantially in a short time. Sorry, I've never heard of the Tree of Might, Shenron replied, disappointing him again. Apparently, the movie's world line and the one Zuke was in were different, what fans call filler versus canon. It seemed that the Tree of Might didn't exist in this world, so relying on its fruits to boost his power was not an option either. It seems that relying on this Shenron for a massive power increase is unrealistic. I'll have to improve gradually, Zuke thought, feeling discouraged as his wishes kept being denied. He'd known Shenron had limits, but this dragon's limitations were excessive. Only 2 Dragon Balls were needed to summon the Shenron, so it made sense that it was far inferior to Earth's Shenron, Namex Shenron, and even the Super Shenron. Since a combat boost wasn't possible, he might as well wish for something practically useful. In that case, can you teach me the instant transmission technique of the Yard Rats? Finally, Zuke settled on this wish. The serial star Shenron simply had too many limitations, forcing him to settle for the next best thing. Opting for the Yardration instant transmission technique wasn't without reason. In Dragon Ball Super, the Yardrat's instant transmission was essentially mastery over ki, and mastering this technique meant achieving a heightened control over one's own ki. When Goku returned after learning instant transmission from the Yardrats, he had reached a new level in controlling his ki. Later, Vegeta would train with them and only manage to use it once. In other words, mastering instant transmission would mean Zuke's ki control would surpass that of the future Vegeta. To be continued. Chapter 8, The Self-Delivered Punching Bag. Honestly, such a hassle. Shoving Minato into his spherical spaceship, Zuke set it to automatically head to the nearest inhabited planet, giving the ship's door a final kick to shut it closed. Although it had taken some twists and turns, his wish for instant transmission had ultimately been granted by the dragon without any real cost. As he mastered the instant transmission technique, Zuke felt something flowing within him, undoubtedly ki, the source of fighting power in Dragon Ball. While others with scouters would still see Zuke's power level as 4,000, his control over ki clearly allowed him to unleash strength well above that level. Now, Zuke could even do something that no other Saiyan could, specifically, what Vegeta described on Namek as controlling power level at will. At this moment, he had lowered his power level to the bare minimum. If someone scanned him with a scouter, it would only pick up a single-digit value, likely mistaking him for some wild animal. This wrapped up faster than I expected. Having set the spherical spaceship to launch in 5 minutes, Zuke looked up at the sky. The once dim night had turned pitch black, and the full moon that had previously hung in the sky was now gone. This was the desperate effort of the Cerealians. After realizing that the Great Ape transformation relied on the full moon, they had put all their strength into destroying it. Yet, even without the full moon, with the Scions reverted to human form, the Cerealians still couldn't match the Scion's power, and they continued to fall under the Scion invasion. Barring any surprises, the civilization on Planet Seral would soon be wiped out. As for Granola, the lone survivor in the original story, Zuke had no idea whether he'd make it this time. After all, Granola survived because Minato had protected him in the original timeline, but now that Minato was in the spaceship, he likely had no chance to protect Granola. As Zuke stood guard beside the spaceship, waiting for it to launch, a notification sound suddenly echoed in his mind, with a window popping up in his vision. Anti-addiction system reminder, respected Zuke, you've been playing for 8 hours. From now on, your gameplay rewards will be 0. Please wait until the next day to refresh your playtime. Seeing this alert, Zuke was stunned. He had thought of many ways to end today's dream, but an anti-addiction notice. That was one he hadn't anticipated. Technically, Zuke's physical age was still underage, but this notice was a bit too much of a buzzkill. Laughing to himself, Zuke looked at his display panel, noticing a new button had appeared at the bottom with the anti-addiction prompt. Exit game. They really went all out with this. Smacking his lips, Zuke was at a loss for words with this system. Despite possessing the ability to sync powers into reality, it still tirelessly maintained that it was just a game. But whether it's a game or not doesn't matter, he's the only player in this world. Player Zuke's power sync rate, 0%. Before logging out, Zuke glanced at his power sync rate, which remained depressingly low at 0%. During this trip to Planet Seral, he had only managed to obtain instant transmission and key control. Although he wasn't sure if effort to grow stronger counted as progressing the main storyline, this slight improvement was clearly just a drop in the bucket. But Zuke wasn't discouraged. He already had a path in mind, and with instant transmission in hand, many future actions would be much easier. While he was deep in thought, the 5 minutes quickly passed. The spherical spaceship shook a few times and then, under Zuke's watchful eye, slowly lifted off and zoomed out of sight. With that done, now. Standing up, Zuke prepared to exit the game and return to reality. Now he knew that the game's anti-addiction time was 8 hours, which conveniently aligned with sleep time. In the future, he wouldn't need to sleep early, just use his normal sleep time. However, as soon as he stood, a sense of danger surged through him. Without thinking, Zuke concentrated ki into his arm and swung forcefully behind him. Bang! A laser beam struck his forearm, blocked by his ki. Zuke turned to see that the shot had come from a man holding a laser gun. "Hey, Saiyan, why are you alone out here?" On a nearby cliff stood a man with blue skin and dreadlocks. His laser gun's barrel was still faintly hot. Zuke looked at the man. Although the men didn't know him, Zuke knew exactly who this guy was. Elec, the leader of the Heaters, the mastermind behind the Frisia Force's invasion of Planet Seral, a cunning merchant, though his strength was rather poor, the weakest of his clan. "What? You're trying to control a Saiyan now?" Zuke looked at Elec, surprised that he had managed to find him. Still, it wasn't much of a problem. Zuke's scouter showed Elec's power level at just above 1000, not very impressive. He had been so focused on the anti-addiction notice that he hadn't noticed someone approaching. It seemed he'd need to be more vigilant in the future. Previously, before arriving on Planet Seral, Zuke might have had the raw power of 4000 but lacked the skill to take down Elec. Now, with key control at his fingertips, defeating Elec, with a power level of 1000, would be a cinch. After all, Frisia and I are partners. If his subordinates don't behave, it's only right I help manage them. Elec seemed blissfully unaware of his lack of power, maintaining an air of superiority even with Frisia, who merely treated him as a puppet in the original story. Is that so? Zuke shifted his footing slightly. Since Elec had seen him, he couldn't afford to let Elec go, or else his disappearance plan would be ruined. If Elec mentioned him, the Frisia Force would learn that a Saiyan was hiding on Planet Seral. Zuke couldn't be sure they wouldn't find him in a search. Several of his upcoming plans depended on avoiding the Frisia Force's attention, and he couldn't let Elec disrupt them, especially when Elec, with his average strength, would make for excellent practice. To be continued. Chapter 9, Free Battle Record. "Hey, you're not planning on attacking me, are you?" Elec noticed Zuke's movements and realized that Zuke seemed ready to attack him. A faint smile appeared on Elec's face. Without a combat power detector, Elec clearly had no idea about the power gap between him and Zuke, or perhaps he simply didn't care. Zuke said nothing. He watched Elec's figure, focusing on Elec's ki. Once he pinpointed its location, Zuke used the instant transmission he'd just learned from Shenron. In an instant, Zuke vanished from his original spot. Almost simultaneously, his massive fist, brimming with powerful ki, struck Elec's face directly. Elec hadn't even realized Zuke had closed in on him. By the time he snapped out of it, his face had completely deformed, and he was sent flying as if struck by a cannonball. Crash! Distant trees shattered as Elec's body smashed through them, leaving him half lying amid the splintered wood. His gaze toward Zuke was filled with fury. "You, damn Saiyan. You have over 1000 combat power, yet you can't even put up a fight." Zuke ignored Elek's curses because he knew Elek's personality well. This guy even dared to look down on Frisia. No one knew where his confidence came from. When it came to business, Elek was indeed skilled. But to someone as powerful as Frisia, Elek's business empire was nothing more than a backup treasury. Using instant transmission again, Zuke appeared in front of Elek. This time, Elek was quick to react. Despite having some combat ability, he instinctively drew a laser gun and fired rapidly at the afterimage that had appeared before him. The laser gun, already modified to increase its power, became even more destructive with Elek's energy injection. If aimed at the moon, it could likely blow it apart. However, the barrage of shots didn't harm Zuke. Before they reached him, he had fortified the target area of his body with ki, enduring the lasers head-on. This defensive move was Zuke's manual version of Ultra Instinct, modeled after Son Goku's technique. Unlike Ultra Instinct, which allows the body to autonomously channel ki to the relevant areas for defense and offense, Zuke had to do it manually. Though it required more thought and couldn't provide the automatic power boost of Ultra Instinct, for Zuke, who had full control over his ki, it was a solid way to enhance his capabilities. At the very least, it allowed him to deliver attack and defense beyond his recorded combat power. Damn you, monkey. When his attack proved useless, Elek finally panicked. Yet, his mouth remained stubbornly defiant, still hurling insults at Zuke. Testing his ki control on Elek, Zuke was pleased with the outcome. This manual Ultra Instinct could come in handy at critical moments. He stepped up to Elek, grabbed him by the neck, and lifted him off the ground. Wait. We can still talk about this. Being held up like a rag doll, Elek finally sensed the gravity of the situation and softened his tone. In the past, relying on his influence, he'd ruled the cosmos unchallenged, even gaining Frisia's respect. This made him look down on those with power, fostering his arrogance. But now, he finally realized that some people simply didn't care about his influence. His vast empire across the universe was meaningless if they could crush him with ease. If he could survive Zuke's grasp, perhaps Elek would come to value the strength he'd always overlooked. There's nothing to discuss. You may not know me, but I know you very well. Zuke looked into Elek's pleading eyes and slowly shook his head. Just as he'd learned about Minato's meek personality from the comics, he'd also learned about Elek's character. This guy might be weak, but his cunning was genuine. If Zuke let him go, he'd bet he'd face Frisia's troops the very next day. After all, Zuke's actions clearly constituted betrayal against Frisia's forces. Frisia wouldn't tolerate such behavior, and even if he didn't deal with Zuke personally, his subordinates would make trouble. You. Elek tried to speak, but Zuke didn't let him finish. With a forceful squeeze, Elek's neck snapped with a crack. Zuke tossed Elek's lifeless body to the ground, then extended his right hand, firing a ki blast to disintegrate the corpse, just in case Elek had any tricks up his sleeve. And so, Elek, the leader of the renowned Heater clan in the universe, perished quietly in a remote corner of Planet Seral, leaving no trace. Colder than I expected. Zuke looked at his right hand, which had just choked the life out of someone and destroyed the body, yet he felt oddly calm. After all, he had already watched other Saiyans invade the Seral people's cities with indifference. The burst of ki from that last blast might have attracted attention. I should leave. Initially, Zuke planned to suppress his ki, pretending to be a wild animal until he could leave this world. But plans change. Elek's appearance forced him to act. Though Elek was weak and didn't require much effort, it still took some power to finish him. If someone had scanned the area with a combat power detector when he used the ki blast, they might have detected a powerful presence nearby, so he had to leave. Log out. Now, Zuke didn't need to suppress his ki or hide. The log out option had appeared, allowing him to disappear from this world. Though he hadn't progressed in the main mission tonight and couldn't synchronize his strength back to reality, he had still laid a solid foundation. To be continued. Chapter 10, Even a Mosquito's Leg Has Meat. Transitioning to Shin. Slowly opening his eyes, Shin found himself back in reality, lying under the warm covers, just as he had been when he fell asleep, still in his pajamas. He picked up his phone from beside his pillow and glanced at the screen, 6 a.m. In other words, he had actually slept for 12 hours since going to bed yesterday, a long rest, which explained why he felt so energetic now. But that exit was way too simple. I thought there'd be some kind of results screen or something. Sitting up from under the covers, Shin stretched and couldn't help but complain. Based on how systems in the novels he'd read usually worked, leaving a mission world should come with some kind of summary screen, right? It would recap what he had done in the mission world, any changes that occurred, how many points he'd earned, and then unlock a bunch of shop items. Unfortunately, after calling out to the system, Shin found it unresponsive, completely and utterly dead. His idea of getting some points and maybe a starter pack from the system was shot down, so he could only get out of bed, ready to wash up and head to school. This apartment was one Shin rented. After arriving in this world, he found he had a decent balance in his account, which, if used reasonably, could last him until the end of high school. So, there was no need to rush to find a part-time job. As for his parents, Shin hadn't heard a thing about them. His phone's contacts list didn't even have any numbers for them, so it seemed like this identity truly was that of an orphan. Stepping into the bathroom, Shin, as usual, picked up his toothbrush and rinse cup. But soon, he sensed something was off. It feels like I'm stronger. No, not just a bit stronger. I'm way stronger. He furrowed his brow slightly, looking down at his hand gripping the toothbrush. Unlike in novels where people crush things because they can't control their strength, he hadn't snapped the toothbrush. Still, this sudden surge in strength was real. Not only the toothbrush, he vaguely felt that if he wanted, he could crush the wall next to him as if it were made of tofu. Could it be? Realizing the change, Shin quickly opened the system, game, checking his stats. Mission World, Dragonball. Main mission, defeat 100% power Frieza. Player Kobold's strength synchronization, 0%. Please strive to advance the main mission to unlock strength synchronization. Still at 0%, no progress. Then where did this strength come from? Seeing the big 0 on the screen, Shin was stunned. After thinking for a moment, he made a guess. Could it be that this 0% actually has decimals? Like 0.5% or something. And since the panel doesn't display decimals, it just shows 0%. Though it was just a theory, Shin felt this was likely, otherwise, he had no way to explain why his strength had increased so much. Moreover, the level of power boost was pretty impressive. Apart from Saiyan synchronization, he couldn't think of any other possibility. If I remember right, according to Dragon Ball, a regular adult has a power level of 5. Based on this, my power level should be around 20, meaning I probably synchronized about 0.5% of my power. Clenching his fist, Shin sensed the strength within him, along with the faint ki he could now feel inside. He estimated his current power level. Having previously experienced a power level of 4,000, Shin could make a rough guess at his current power, which, though it might not be exact, wouldn't be too far off. Sure, a power level of 20 might be trivial in the Dragon Ball world, but in a modern, city-centric mixed anime world like this, it made him a small superhero. With this power, what should I do? After washing up, Shin returned to his bedroom, packing his school bag as he pondered. So far, he hadn't noticed anything unusual about this world. Other than a mix of some daily life manga characters, everything seemed quite peaceful. No man-eating ghouls, no zombie crises, and no superheroes across the ocean keeping world peace. After thinking for a bit, Shin made a decision. Given the situation, he'd just go to school for now. Yes, he really couldn't think of anything to do in the real world. He was a person who preferred to avoid trouble, and while this strength could bring fame and wealth quickly, it was also a hassle. He was someone who went with the flow. A power level of 20 was strong, but still within a martial artist's scope. It could stop bullets, but maybe not cannonballs. At least it was far from letting him do whatever he wanted. Given that, there was no need to worry about it now. He'd rather keep building his power and synchronization in the dream world. Compared to enjoying life in the real world, his focus was still on the main mission in the Dragon Ball world. Defeating a 100% powered Frieza. Even though the main mission didn't state what constituted failure, if he didn't keep pushing forward, his synchronization rate would probably remain at 0%. Though, it seems I can use instant transmission. Picking up his bag, Shin tried out the instant transmission skill in his mind. In the next instant, he teleported from his bedroom to the living room. Since his synchronization was only around 0.5%, the instant transmission wasn't perfect, and the distance he could travel wasn't far. but for Shin in the real world, it was enough. Plus, this Infinite Terror VR game, since it's called Infinite Terror, it should have other mission worlds to explore too. I wonder how to unlock them. Leaving home and walking to school, Shin continued to ponder his system. After all, compared to the mundane life of the real world, the mission worlds were far more exciting. Even though he enjoyed a peaceful life here, it didn't mean he couldn't seek thrills in the mission worlds. Becoming stronger was something every man desired, and Shin was no exception. If he got the chance to become a Super Saiyan and take down Frieza in his full power, just imagining it was thrilling. Does it unlock automatically over time? Or do I have to complete a world's main mission to access the next one? If so, then the Dragon Ball world is probably going to block me for quite a while. With that thought, Shin couldn't help but sigh inwardly. Sure, the Dragon Ball world was great, but if the main mission there stopped him from unlocking other worlds, he'd find it rather unfortunate. To be continued. Chapter 11, The Low-Profile Megumi Kato. Hey, Akagi, how was the karaoke yesterday? Shin walked into the classroom, took his seat, and looked over at a male classmate named Akagi, who was standing nearby. The surname Akagi was fairly common, and this student appeared to be an average, unremarkable student, though Shin had heard that he had a cousin at another school who played basketball well and supposedly looked like a gorilla. This Akagi was the very person Shin had invited to karaoke yesterday, promising him that someone would invite Yutaha Kasumigakaka as well. Don't even mention it, Kasumigakaka-senpai didn't show up at all. Akagi's face fell as he heard Shin, clearly disappointed. He'd been eager to get close to that high flower on the hill for some time but had never had the chance. He'd thought yesterday might finally be his opportunity to exchange a few words with Yutaha Kasumigakaka, but the student who had sworn she would come had failed to deliver. To make matters worse, because I said you'd be there, a lot of girls showed up just to see you. Akagi looked at Shin with a wounded expression, sounding like a resentful spouse as he ground his teeth. When they found out you didn't come, I ended up on the bad side of several girls. Damn it, Shin. This is all your fault. You're the one who exaggerated. You can't blame me for that. Shin shrugged, clearly picking up on the fact that Akagi was just venting and not truly upset with him, so he responded casually. You shouldn't use Shin's name to talk to girls like that. Other classmates overheard Shin and Akagi's conversation and joined in teasing Akagi, making the scene lively. This was Shin's typical social situation at school. If the student community could be divided into tiers, Shin fit comfortably in the middle of the pyramid. He wasn't isolated or bullied, but he wasn't as admired as the popular group led by Hayama Hayato either. He sat in a relatively balanced position. Despite occasionally drawing some attention due to his striking looks, he didn't stand out too much. If one had to compare, he was a bit like Yoshihiro Kira, a person with the qualities to be at the top but choosing to keep himself at a middle level. As Shin chatted casually with his classmates, he suddenly sensed someone sitting down in the seat in front of him. He'd been working on honing his sensitivity to ki in real life, so he kept his awareness up all the time. Any change in the atmosphere around him immediately caught his attention. Naturally, he noticed the presence in front of him, but soon he realized something odd. He hadn't paid any attention to who sat in front of him before, had he? Shin had a decent memory. Even though his grades were average, he could easily be at the top if he wanted to. With such a good memory, it shouldn't be possible for him to forget who sat in front of him, yet somehow, he'd never noticed this detail before. When he finally looked at the girl who had sat down in front of him, everything clicked. Megumi Kato. The female protagonist from a work he'd seen in his past life, notable for her uncanny ability to fade into the background, almost as if she possessed a superpower that made her easy to overlook. Had he not noticed her presence through sensing her ki, he might have continued ignoring the girl sitting in front of him. Although she was quite pretty, her peculiar lack of presence had caused her to be persistently overlooked. Megumi Kato, sitting in front, seemed to have noticed Shin's gaze and turned around, meeting his eyes. Shin, were you looking at me? Most girls would feel a little offended if they were stared at so intently, though girls who were attracted to looks might enjoy Shin's gaze. However, Megumi's question carried none of those implications. She was simply expressing mild surprise. After all, no one had ever looked at her so intently before. Her expression was calm, making it hard to tell what she was thinking, whether she was pleased or slightly annoyed by Shin's attention. Even her tone was completely neutral. Yes, because I hadn't really noticed who sat in front of me before, Kato. Shin chuckled, offering a straightforward response. He'd previously overlooked her due to her low profile, but now that he was attuned to her ki, her presence became clear to him. Saying things like that to a girl is sure to lose you some points, you know. Megumi tried to frown, probably aiming to look a bit displeased, but it came off as slightly endearing instead. Clearly, she wasn't actually offended by Shin's words. She was long used to being overlooked, and inwardly, she was somewhat happy that Shin had noticed her. But if Shin talks to me more often from now on, I might be happy. Despite her words, Megumi didn't have high hopes. She suspected Shin had only noticed her by chance this time and would soon overlook her again. Is that so? Then I'll take you up on that offer. Shin detected the hint of regret in Megumi's words and, understanding her thoughts, decided he wouldn't overlook her anymore. So he agreed readily. Shin, after school today, come with me somewhere. At that moment, Akaji suddenly interrupted the conversation, clasping his hands together in a pleading gesture. It wasn't that he was being rude on purpose, he simply hadn't noticed Megumi's presence or that Shin had been talking to her. Megumi, however, was already accustomed to this, so she smiled at Shin and turned around, preparing her textbooks for class. Annoyed at having his conversation with Megumi interrupted, Shin gave Akaji an exasperated look and asked, "Where to?" Since he knew he had up to 8 hours before his next mission, he wasn't in any rush to go home early and sleep, so he could keep his usual schedule. To be continued. Chapter 12, The Non-Problem Child and the Service Club. Service Club. Usually, Shin went straight home after school without spending time with classmates, so Akaji hadn't expected much when he invited him. But unexpectedly, Shin seemed to change his tune, asking where they were going, which caught Akaji by surprise and sparked his enthusiasm. While Shin appeared ordinary, Akaji knew his true abilities were far beyond what he showed. Having Shin along gave him confidence. The Service Club. Shin was surprised by Akaji's answer. He recognized the name, it was a club featured in a work from his previous life. It had been founded by Yukino, a well-known girl at school. With her excellent grades and aloof attitude toward others, she often attracted attention. Of course, her disregard for others' opinions made her unpopular with some, and despite her exceptional looks and talents, many teachers saw her as a problematic child. Shin's homeroom teacher, Hiratsuka Shizuka, was one of those teachers deeply concerned with students' mental health. She'd repeatedly tried to address Yukino's problematic personality. In the original story, Hiratsuka's approach was to throw another problem child into Yukino's service club, hoping the two troubled kids might support each other. Shin couldn't quite grasp her reasoning, but he doubted such a scenario would play out in this world. After all, he hadn't heard of the master, the protagonist Hachiman Hikigaya, as readers in his previous life had called him. This wasn't Sobu High School but rather the private Toyosaki Academy. With students from different works crammed into one school, it was inevitable that some students wouldn't make the cut. Hikigaya Hachiman, unfortunately, might have ended up elsewhere. As for Shin, given his typical behavior at school, Hiratsuka Shizuka wouldn't see him as a problem child, let alone force him into the service club. Honestly, while Yukino's high-up and untouchable persona was appealing in fiction, Shin figured reality might not feel the same way. Even if you're out of touch, you should have heard of it, right? After all, it's the club Yukino established. Akaji wore an eager smile as he extended the invitation to Shin. The service club was already well known. Yukino had explained that it offered support to students facing difficulties and would accept any request from students. However, it was evident that Akaji had other motives. He was simply eager to meet the elusive Yukino. In fairness, Akaji wasn't lacking. Possibly due to family genetics, he was athletic and didn't share his cousin's overly bulky build. This ideal, athlete boy image gave Akaji some popularity among girls. If he wanted, he could probably find a cute girlfriend to experience a sweet high school romance. But his ambition was too high, always seeking out the school's renowned girls, only to be disappointed every time. Yesterday it was Kasumiga Yutaha, and now Yukino. Rumor had it that Akaji once tried to join the art club just to meet another famous beauty, Sawamura Spencer, only to be kicked out because he'd eaten all their fruit supplies before even meeting her. His classmates teased him for days. Even if I know your motive, you should have a reason to go to the service club, right? Shin looked at Akagi, helplessly. The service club is a place where students submit requests. If you go with nothing, Yukino Shida might just kick you out. Hearing this, Akagi's expression shifted, and he nodded earnestly, probably recalling how he'd been booted from the art club. Good point. How about I ask them to teach me soccer? Aren't you the star of the soccer club? Going to the service club to learn soccer sounds like you're just picking a fight. Shin rubbed his forehead, exasperated. Akagi was a top player in the soccer club, few in the entire school matched his skills. Did he really expect Yukino to teach him soccer? Was he going there to stir things up? Despite Akagi's haphazard approach, Shin decided to go with him to the service club. After all, Akagi would probably head there on his own anyway. It seemed better to accompany him, partly to prevent Akagi from embarrassing himself too much, and partly because he was curious to see Yukino, a character he'd only seen in illustrations in his previous life. Alright, it's settled. I'll come up with a request for Yukino today, and after school, you're coming with me, Shin. Now that Shin had agreed, Akagi's confidence surged. It seemed he knew how unreliable he could be and felt better with Shin to keep things steady. You should focus on your studies. Shin couldn't help but throw in a jab. Judging by Akagi's words, he'd spend the whole day thinking of a request for the service club, leaving no room for studying. Shin, are you also interested in Yukino? After Akagi left, Kato Megumi, seated in front of him, turned around and asked. She had overheard the conversation and knew Shin planned to go to the service club with Akagi after school. Akagi's intentions were transparent, but Shin's were less clear. Kato Megumi was a bit curious if Shin had his own reasons for going to see Yukino. For a boy who noticed her and willingly talked to her, Kato Megumi found herself a little curious. I suppose you could say I'm interested, though not in the way you'd expect. Shin responded with a smile. His interest in Yukino was more a curiosity about seeing an illustrated character come to life, unlike Akagi's intentions. In the past, he might have avoided high-profile girls to maintain a peaceful life, but now he was more open to it. Maybe his newfound strength made him feel more at ease. Is that so? Kato Megumi looked puzzled. Clearly, she didn't fully understand Shin's response. To be continued. Chapter 13, The Invisible Protagonist. That's all for today's lesson. Class dismissed, Hiratsuka Shizuka announced as she gathered her books. Her gaze swept over the students in the classroom before finally resting on Akagi. Some students have been daydreaming all day today. It'd be best if I didn't catch you doing that a second time. The class burst into laughter, everyone well aware of whom she was referring to. It was none other than Akagi, who had spent the entire day pondering what kind of request to send to the service club. The reason why all the students knew about Akagi's inattentiveness was simple. During math class, he was called upon to answer a question. When asked to solve a multiple-choice problem, he gave a shocking answer. The Mediterranean. The math teacher, who already had a bald spot reminiscent of the Mediterranean Sea, turned red with anger. This incident would probably leave Akagi the butt of jokes until the end of the semester. Shin had no idea what was going on in Akagi's head or what kind of request he was planning to make to the service club that would lead him to blurt out Mediterranean. If Akagi kept having more slip-ups like today, he might end up classified as a problem child by Hiratsuka Shizuka, and who knows, maybe he'd be sent off to the service club one day. Of course, Akagi seemed completely unaware that being labeled a problem child had such perks. Kato, I'm heading out. See you tomorrow, Shin said, as he packed his bag and waved to Kato Megumi, who was seated in the row ahead. Now, thanks to his ability to sense ki, Kato's presence felt no different from that of an ordinary person. All right, Shin. See you tomorrow. Kato turned around in surprise, not expecting Shin to actually notice her and greet her. She had thought it was just a coincidence when Shin noticed her earlier that morning. Occasionally, people would accidentally notice her for various reasons, but they would soon overlook her again. But now it seemed that Shin really could notice her consistently, which made her feel both a bit surprised and happy. Although she had long been accustomed to being overlooked, it didn't mean she completely disliked being noticed. Shin's attention gave her a rare feeling of being seen. Shin. Let's go. However, It seemed Shin was the only one who noticed her. Akagi, standing beside him, paid no attention to Shin bidding farewell to Kato, eagerly urging Shin to head to the service club together. Standing at the entrance of the service club, Shin and Akagi did not knock on the door right away. The reason was simple: as they reached the door, they overheard voices inside, indicating there were other visitors. Out of courtesy, Shin stopped at the entrance to wait, pulling back Akagi, who was about to barge in. If Akagi made a fool of himself, it would reflect poorly on Shin, who was accompanying him. So, Shin felt compelled to intervene. However, Akagi, having been pulled back, noticed something else. "Ah! Shin, how did your strength suddenly increase?" He curiously looked at Shin's right hand, which had grabbed him by the collar and yanked him back so forcefully that he nearly stumbled. While Akagi wasn't the most reliable person, he was confident in his own strength, so Shin's effortless pull came as a surprise. "I've just been working out," Shin replied casually, using exercise as an excuse rather than revealing, "I synced this combat strength from another world." With a combat power of 20, his strength was indeed formidable. But a simple act like pulling Akagi back wouldn't make Akagi suspect that Shin had become a bullet-catching powerhouse. As they conversed, the door to the service club opened, and a black-haired girl emerged with a worried expression on her face. Upon seeing the two standing at the entrance, the girl seemed startled. She flinched, bowed to them, and then quickly ran off. "Oh. That was Yotsuya Miko from Class D," Akagi remarked. Unlike Shin, Akagi, who was more outgoing, had acquaintances in many classes and happened to know some of the students, including the panicked girl who had just run off. Yotsuya Miko. Hearing her name made Shin's expression turn odd. The reason was simple: Yotsuya Miko was also a character from a manga he had read in his previous life. But the premise of that manga was unusual. It depicted a world where evil spirits that were invisible to most people existed everywhere. These spirits typically wouldn't harm people, but if they discovered someone could see them, they would attack. Yotsuya Miko was that unfortunate individual who had suddenly gained the ability to see these spirits but hadn't acquired any means to deal with them. As a result, she had to pretend not to see them, enduring a life surrounded by malevolent entities while trying to appear normal. Judging by her fearful and flustered appearance just now, she must already be able to see the spirits. She was probably visiting the service club to see if there was a solution. Evil spirits. Shin frowned slightly as he glanced around, but he saw nothing. The limitation of the Dragonball world lay here. While its warriors possessed immense physical strength and could unleash energy blasts using ki, they lacked capabilities in spiritual or soul-related matters. A typical example was the likes of Frisia, who, despite being a galactic overlord, had his soul easily bound in hell after death, indicating weaknesses in the realm of the soul. This situation began to change only in Dragon Ball Super, where Goku and Vegeta started transforming from mortals to gods, beginning with the Super Saiyan God form. It wasn't until then that their souls began to grow stronger, but that was far beyond Shin's current abilities, as he couldn't even transform into a regular Super Saiyan yet, let alone a Super Saiyan God. Though the Super Saiyan God transformation wasn't directly related to the Super Saiyan form, it required an elaborate ritual involving 6 righteous-hearted Saiyans pooling their energy into one individual. Finding 6 righteous-hearted Saiyans in the current era of Dragon Ball would be nearly impossible. Even Bardock probably wouldn't qualify. Focusing ki on my eyes can enhance my dynamic vision, but it doesn't allow me to see spirits. It seems I need to strengthen my mind and soul. After trying to use ki to enhance his vision without any success, Shin realized his current limitations. Knowing that there might be evil spirits lurking everywhere in this world, he couldn't remain indifferent. The thought of those disgusting entities potentially being nearby made him uneasy. I wonder when I'll unlock a second world, perhaps it could help me address this issue. To be continued. Chapter 14, High School Youth. Come in. With Yukino's cold voice, Shin and Akagi finally stepped into the service club room. As Shin had expected, Yukino was the only one present. It seemed that Hachiman Hikigaya, the protagonist from the original work, really wasn't at this school, or else Hiratsuka Shizuka would have likely thrown him in here by now. So, is there anything you would like to request? Yukino's gaze swept over Shin and Akagi, lingering briefly on Shin. People are visual creatures, and even Yukino wasn't immune to this. Compared to Akagi, Shin clearly aligned more with her aesthetic preferences, which made her look at him a bit longer. However, Yukino wasn't shallow, and appearances were something she didn't particularly care about, so she quickly withdrew her gaze and asked them both, "Go ahead, what is it you would like to request?" Shin glanced at Akagi beside him, unsure of what Akagi had in mind for the request. Surely it wouldn't be something absurd like asking for help with a Mediterranean hairstyle. Ahem, actually. Akagi cleared his throat twice, and then, as if reading from a prepared speech, he spoke up loudly, "I want to ask the service club to help me pursue a girl." Huh. Hearing Akagi's request, Yukino showed no particular reaction, but Shin, standing next to him, was taken aback. It wasn't surprising for him to be caught off guard, considering that Akagi had been so adamant about meeting all the well-known beautiful girls at the school. Shin had always assumed he intended to pursue one of them. But now, faced with Yukino, Akagi said he wanted to pursue another girl. Of course, if it were someone else, Shin might have thought, could it be that the girl he's referring to is Yukino herself? But in Akagi's case, he probably lacked the subtlety for such a roundabout approach. If Akagi really wanted to pursue Yukino, he'd most likely just come out and say, "Please go out with me." So, when Akagi mentioned pursuing a girl, he probably meant someone else. "Oh. You're interested in pursuing a girl? Who is it?" Yukino nodded at his words, seemingly intrigued. After all, school romance was a topic that always captivated young people, and as a high school girl herself, it was only natural for Yukino to be a bit interested. Deep down, though Yukino appeared very aloof, she still had a somewhat vibrant inner world. "It's a girl who often comes to watch the soccer team practice." Akagi showed a rare display of shyness, scratching his head as if embarrassed to mention the girl. Seeing Akagi's behavior, Shin looked as if he had seen a ghost. He had been guessing that the other girl might be Yutaha Kasumigakaka or Eruri, but it turned out to be neither. It seemed that although Akagi was enthusiastic about meeting these beautiful girls, he had never actually thought about pursuing them. He probably just saw them as idols. It was quite peculiar, really, that a soccer star would have his idol not be a football celebrity but rather a school beauty. A girl who often watches the soccer team practice. I see. So, you're on the soccer team. With his sporty appearance, it was obvious to Yukino that Akagi was a member of the soccer team. However, Yukino wasn't interested in soccer and didn't know that Akagi was considered one of the top players. "Do you know the girl's name? What class is she in?" I don't know." Akagi responded awkwardly. Despite his interest in the girl, he had evidently never spoken to her. Actually, as a soccer ace, if that girl genuinely had an interest in soccer, Akagi would have had a good chance of striking up a conversation. Yet, despite being so thick-skinned in other situations, Akagi became surprisingly bashful when it really mattered, which Shin found quite surprising. "I see. We'll have to start by gathering the most basic information." Yukino nodded, understanding Akagi's situation. A young soccer player who had taken an interest in a girl who watched their games but was too shy to approach her, such a youthful and innocent reason for asking for help. This request wasn't too challenging, and Yukino quickly made a decision. "You'll be heading to soccer practice soon, right? Will that girl be there?" "Huh. I do have soccer practice soon, and as for that girl, she should be there. She's been coming almost every day lately." Akagi hesitated for a moment before nodding quickly. "All right, go to your soccer practice. I'll be nearby to help you approach her and get a sense of the situation." Yukino was the kind of person who acted promptly. Once she had made a plan, she immediately set it into motion. "Right now? Don't you need to keep an eye on the service club?" Shin asked curiously. Leaving now would mean the service club would be left unattended. Currently, the service club didn't have Hachiman Hikigaya or any other members. Yukino was the only one in charge. If she left, the room would be empty. This can't be helped. Handling requests is the service club's duty. If someone truly needs our help and doesn't find us here this time, they will come back another time. Yukino replied calmly and looked at Shin. "You're his friend, aren't you? Do you want to come along and help?" Shin thought for a moment. Since he only had 8 hours in this dream world, which conveniently matched his sleep time, he didn't have any pressing reason to leave early. With a decent amount of money in his bank account, he didn't need to take on a part-time job, and going home now would just mean playing video games. Though Akagi could be a bit clueless, he had been helpful in easing Shin into some social circles at school. From Shin's perspective, Akagi was indeed a friend. Since his friend needed help, Shin had no reason to refuse. Sure, I also want to see what kind of girl Akagi is interested in. Good, then let's go. Yukino nodded and naturally took the lead, walking ahead. Shin and Akagi instinctively followed, then exchanged glances, momentarily surprised. They hadn't expected Yukino to so easily take on the role of their leader. One had to admit that Yukino had quite a commanding presence. To be continued. Chapter 15, Under the Snow, Take Action. When they reached the field, it was Akagi's territory. The moment he met up with the soccer club members, he quickly started training with them. Meanwhile, Shin and Yukino stood by the sidelines, watching Akagi's lively figure on the field as they set about completing Akagi's request. Shin, do you think Akagi is good at soccer? Yukino stood by the field, watching the back-and-forth action, and voiced her curiosity. I'm not very familiar with soccer, and I don't really understand the rules. Indeed, Yukino didn't seem like someone who would be interested in soccer. She looked more like the typical talented girl, the kind who would be better suited to discussing academics than sports. He's pretty good, I guess. After all, he's the star player of the soccer club. Shin stroked his chin while watching Akagi on the field. From his current perspective, everyone on the soccer field seemed to be moving in slow motion, but then, he wasn't an ordinary person anymore. From a high schooler's point of view, Akagi's skills were indeed worthy of the star player title. His performance was quite outstanding. However, Shin couldn't help but wonder if Akagi's teammates were showing off because Yukino was present at the sidelines. It was as if they were trying to impress the usually hard-to-see Snow Girl. Unfortunately, their efforts didn't catch Yukino's attention. She was fully focused on the service club's task, carefully scanning the crowd around the field. According to Akagi, the girl he was interested in was someone who had been coming to watch the soccer teams practice every day lately. I remember Akagi said the girl has short pink hair. Yukino's eyes roamed around the field's perimeter. Given the large area, she couldn't immediately identify the target. There, over there. Shin quickly spotted the girl in question, patted Yukino on the shoulder, and pointed in her direction. Yukino was momentarily stunned but followed Shin's finger. Sure enough, she saw a short-haired pink girl standing in a corner of the field, watching the soccer players. You've got sharp eyes, Shin. Yukino glanced at Shin, surprised that he had found the target so quickly. My perception is quite good. Shin didn't deny it. With his ability to sense ki, he could instantly identify the aura of everyone around the field, allowing him to pinpoint their targets swiftly. Humph, is that so? Yukino gave a noncommittal reply and walked toward the girl, gesturing to Shin as she did. Leave talking to that girl to me. Indeed, it was better for Yukino, as a fellow girl, to gather information from her. If Shin were to approach her out of the blue, rumors would probably start circulating the next day. After all, Shin's appearance was quite remarkable, and he had quite the reputation among the girls. There would certainly be many who'd enjoy discussing gossip about him. But now that I think about it, wouldn't the fact that I'm standing here with Yukino lead to some rumors of its own? It suddenly occurred to Shin that his presence with Yukino at the sidelines could easily be misinterpreted. Don't underestimate the curiosity of high school students in Japan. Seeing a boy and girl together often meant they were just one step away from dating in many people's eyes. Yukino didn't seem to realize the implications of appearing together with Shin either, or, if rumors did emerge, she probably wouldn't care. Shin watched as Yukino approached the pink-haired girl and began conversing. He stayed in place, waiting for her to return. Before Yukino came back, Akagi walked over. He had taken a break in the middle of practice and seized the opportunity to check in on their progress. Yukino is asking the girl for information right now. Let's wait until she comes back. Shin pointed in the direction of Yukino and the pink-haired girl, then spoke to Akagi. That's the right girl, right? It'd be embarrassing if you questioned the wrong person. Yes, it's her. She's been coming to watch the soccer teams practice every day. Akagi nodded hurriedly, confirming that Shin and Yukino hadn't approached the wrong person. Hey, Shin, do you think she likes me? Akagi, there are a lot of people on the soccer team. How can you be sure she's coming here just for you? Though Shin didn't want to discourage his friend, Akaji's confidence was a bit over the top. Shin felt he had to temper it a little. If the girl wasn't actually interested in Akaji, he'd be in for a huge letdown later. Better to prepare him now than to have him face a major blow. I'm not that bad, am I? Akaji looked back at the other soccer players on the field, most of whom were big and burly. To be fair, compared to them, Akaji's looks were indeed quite attractive. No wonder Akaji had such confidence. His teammates made him look better by comparison. More importantly, Yukino Shida coming to the field seems to have really fired up those guys. After comparing himself to the other players and finding his confidence, Akaji shifted the topic to Yukino. Clearly, Shin's earlier suspicion was correct. The soccer players were indeed trying harder because of Yukino's presence. Shin commented on their behavior with a touch of amusement. Displaying themselves in front of a female to perform mating behavior, how foolish of these male animals. Are you not a male too? Akaji looked at Shin in disbelief, wondering why he was even berating himself. And actually, a few of the players have asked me if there's anything going on between you and Yukino Shida. Akaji's face showed genuine curiosity, as if he also wanted to know the answer. Those soccer players might not know, but shouldn't you? Shin glared at Akaji. This is the first time I've even met Yukino Shida, and it's because you dragged me here. How could there be anything between us? Well, feels good though, right? Akaji poked Shin with his elbow, parroting a line straight out of a Chinpai-sai skit, with an expression that said, I totally get it. Earlier, didn't you pat Yukino Shida on the shoulder? What are you, a grade schooler? Just a shoulder pat and you're already thinking nonsense. Shin gave Akaji a light kick on the butt. Though it wasn't forceful, it was enough to send him stumbling back onto the field. Your teammates are calling you. Get back to training. Once you're done, we'll share the information Yukino Shida gathers. To be continued. Chapter 16, The Scheming Advisor Yukino Shida. Akaji was sent back to continue training with the soccer club members, and before long, Yukino Shida returned to Shin's side. How did it go? Did you find anything out? Shin was somewhat skeptical about whether Yukino Shida could gather useful information. After all, from what he knew of her character, Yukino Shida tended to be rather cold. Although Shin was aware that she was warm on the inside despite her aloof exterior, it wouldn't be far-fetched to say that she had communication issues. Even acquaintances could find it hard to keep up with her pace and easily get flustered. However, from what he saw earlier, the girl she had been talking to seemed to get along quite well with Yukino Shida, suggesting she was the type who could keep up with Yukino Shida's rhythm. To put it simply, the girl wasn't too self-centered and was good at going along with what others said. If she were also someone who spoke bluntly, she probably would have ended up arguing with Yukino Shida. Of course. Yukino Shida raised an eyebrow and even had a small notebook in her hand. It seemed she not only gathered information but also took notes. This surprised Shin, as he didn't recall seeing Yukino Shida holding a notebook during the conversation. He had no idea when she wrote anything down. But that was probably because he hadn't been paying close attention to her. Otherwise, with his ability to sense ki, nothing Yukino did would escape his notice. Tamiya Saiyan, a student in Class 1C. Her father was a soccer player, and her older brother also loved soccer, which made her fond of watching boys play soccer from a young age. Yukino Shida opened the notebook and read out the information she had collected, sounding as if she were reciting a textbook. She seems interested in becoming the soccer club manager but is too shy to submit the application, so she just watches the soccer club's training from the sidelines, imagining how she would handle things if she were the manager. So, she's watching the soccer team not because she's interested in any boy but because she's interested in soccer. Shin scratched his head, unsure whether this was good or bad news for Akaji. The good news was that this girl, Tamiya Saiyan, wasn't interested in any of the soccer club members. The bad news was that she wasn't interested in Akaji either. Her focus was on the sport and the club itself. That's right, so I accepted Tamiya Saiyan's request and decided to help her join the soccer club as the manager. Yukino Shida nodded in satisfaction and quickly closed her notebook, announcing her new decision. So, you picked up a new request while gathering information. Shin looked at Yukino Shida in disbelief. She really was eager to help people. Akaji's request hadn't even been completed yet, and here she was, taking on another one. The requests from Akagi and Tamiya don't conflict, in fact, they complement each other. Yukino Shita explained her reasoning seriously. She was always this thorough and didn't accept Tamiya's request on a whim. Helping Tamiya join the soccer club as the manager will also create opportunities for Akagi to interact with her. Don't you think it's a win-win situation? That's true, but I still think even if they are in the same club, they might not have many chances to interact. Shin admitted Yukino had a point but shared his concerns. As you said, Tamiya is too shy to even submit the application, and Akagi always hesitates at crucial moments, never daring to speak to her. Are you sure they'll be able to connect? Indeed, their personalities pose a problem. Even if we put them together, they may not talk to each other. If some other soccer club member steps in, the plan could fail. Yukino Shita pondered for a moment, realizing the challenge. Tamiya's issues can be addressed. I've already gotten her contact information, so I can privately meet with her to help her work on her shyness. You even got her contact information. Shin's view of Yukino Shita shifted. If she weren't a girl, she'd probably be a master at picking up women. She managed to get the contact information of a girl she'd just met. Then again, if Yukino Shita weren't a girl, Tamiya Cheyenne probably wouldn't have lowered her guard so easily. But it's not as easy with Akagi, since he's a guy. I don't really understand boys' personalities. While Yukino Shita could coach Tamiya Cheyenne, she felt at a loss when it came to helping Akagi, so she turned her gaze toward Shin. Why are you looking at me? I'm not a member of the service club. Seeing Yukino Shita's gaze, Shin quickly responded. Her eyes made him feel like a recruit being drafted. Shin, Akagi is your friend. When your friend is in trouble, shouldn't you help? Yukino Shita sighed, seeing Shin's expression as though he were facing a wild beast. I don't think Akagi needs me to step in. Even if he hesitates, he'll eventually take the initiative. Shin shook his head. Having spent some time with Akagi, he understood him enough to know that even if this romantic opportunity slipped away, it wouldn't faze him much. But that would mean the service club's request remains incomplete. Yukino Shita wasn't satisfied with that outcome. As the founder of the service club, she wanted to fulfill their classmates' requests as thoroughly as possible. Okay, then, what's your plan if I agree to help? Shin considered it for a moment. Although he wasn't obligated to assist Yukino Shita, since this involved his friend, he didn't mind helping this time. He certainly wasn't willing to become a regular helper for the service club, but assisting Akagi once wouldn't be a problem. It's simple. If you're worried that they won't interact smoothly after Tamiya joins the soccer club, then create a situation where they can talk alone. Seeing Shin's apparent agreement, Yukino Shita relaxed and explained her plan. This weekend, I'll arrange a meeting with Tamiya, and you'll invite Akagi. Then, we'll leave, letting them spend time together. After hearing Yukino Shita's plan, Shin fell silent. It seemed a bit too simplistic. Even if they left them alone, there was no guarantee Tamiya and Akagi wouldn't part ways immediately. And even if they didn't, would Tamiya really become interested in Akagi? Based on Yukino Shita's earlier report, Tamiya didn't seem to have any intention of pursuing romance. However, seeing Yukino Shita's confident expression, Shin understood. In the end, Yukino Shita was just a naive schemer with no real experience in love. To be continued. Chapter 17, The Pot Calling the Kettle Black. Although Shin was not very optimistic about Yukino's proposed plan, after some thought, he still agreed. Alright, let me know when you're planning to execute the plan over the weekend. I happen to have some things to take care of then, so it'll be a good excuse for me to get away from those two. After all, Yukino might be a clueless strategist when it came to love, but had Shin ever been in a relationship either? No. Shin himself was also a novice when it came to romance, not much different from Yukino. If there was a difference, it was that at least he wouldn't be as confidently assertive as she was when devising plans for others. However, if he rejected Yukino's plan, he couldn't come up with a better alternative himself. In that case, the atmosphere would likely become quite awkward. So, to avoid being mocked by Yukino, Shin simply agreed to her plan. After all, if the plan succeeded, everyone would be happy. If it failed, it would be Yukino, Akagi, and Tamiya who would be embarrassed. What did that have to do with Shin? However, after agreeing to the plan, Shin noticed that Yukino was still staring at him. he instinctively raised his hand to touch his face. Why are you looking at me like that? Is there something on my face? Give me your contact information. How else am I supposed to inform you over the weekend? Through a dream. Yukino looked a bit exasperated, holding her phone and waiting for a while, not expecting Shin to have no reaction at all. Exchanging contact information, shouldn't the guy take the initiative in such things? Why did she have to be the one to bring it up? Only then did Shin realize and quickly took out his phone to exchange contact details with Yukino. As they swapped contacts, Shin glanced at her phone screen. It had only a few contacts, one of which was just recently added, Tamiya Saiyan. It made sense, considering Yukino's past attitude towards social interactions. She didn't seem like someone who could easily make many friends, so it was natural that her contact list was quite sparse. In fact, the only male contact on her phone was her father, making Shin likely the first peer of the opposite sex in her contact list. After the soccer club's practice ended, Shin and Yukino parted ways. Yukino said she would go back and carefully think about how to match Akagi and Tamiya together, and told Shin to stay alert for her messages. To this, Shin could only express that as long as she was happy, it was fine. He was approaching her plan with a "what if it works" mindset. In Yukino's eyes, her interactions with Shin were merely part of fulfilling a service club request, but to outsiders, it was a different story. Hey, Shin, how did you get so close to Yukino so quickly? After the soccer practice ended, Akagi looked as though he had seen a ghost. Despite being drenched in sweat, he rushed over, eager to question Shin. He had clearly seen Shin and Yukino exchange contact information. The usually aloof Yukino, who spoke to everyone with cold indifference, had exchanged contact details with Shin, his male friend. Don't come near me with that sweat. Shin disdainfully pressed his finger against Akagi's forehead to push him away, unimpressed by his overreaction. Yukino is just fulfilling a service club request, nothing more. Don't overthink it. But it seemed Akagi hadn't heard Shin's explanation at all. He was already lost in his thoughts, much to Shin's helplessness. Just as he had thought, when it came to these teenagers in the midst of their youth, even a small spark could be blown out of proportion. He had merely exchanged contact information with Yukino, yet judging by Akagi's reaction, it was as if Shin had already stepped into adulthood. Alright, let me tell you what Yukino found out about that girl you're interested in. After that, we'll figure out how to get you closer to her. Shin knew that continuing to explain would be pointless, so he simply changed the subject, offering information about Tamiya Saiyan to catch Akagi's attention. Indeed, the mention of Tamiya Saiyan's details quickly made Akagi forget about his friend being romantically involved with a famous beauty at school. Really? Tell me quickly, I can't wait. After a day at school, Shin returned home. He made a simple meal for dinner, intending to take a bath and then lie down. Yes, he was preparing for his second exploration of the Dragonball world. Last night, in his dreams, he had gained the instant transmission technique and some control over Ki, but he was still far from completing the main quest. The main quest required him to defeat Frieza at 100% power, which meant Shin couldn't resort to sneak attacks and kill Frieza during his first form's 530,000 power level. For Shin, there was no shortcut. Only by improving his strength to the point where he could defeat Frieza head-on could he progress in the main quest. After bathing and changing into his pajamas, Shin sat on his bed, just like the night before. Before going to sleep, he glanced at his phone. To his surprise, there was a message from Yukino on the screen. What is she messaging me for at this hour? Curious, Shin opened her message. If it had been another girl messaging him late at night, Shin might have gotten excited. But since it was Yukino, he could guess the content even with his toes. Sure enough, it's a plan. This girl really went all out, writing down every step meticulously. Looking at the long plan on the screen, Shin couldn't help but chuckle. Should he praise Yukino for being serious or call her stubborn? When she set her mind to something, she would give it her all. For most people, matchmaking two high school students would be handled casually, but Yukino had crafted such a detailed plan. That was just like her, it matched her personality perfectly. I understand. See you on Saturday morning. After skimming through the lengthy plan, Shin gave a simple reply and put down his phone. Compared to Yukino, the Dragon Ball world was more appealing to him right now. Women would only slow down his Kamehameha. LMFAO. Who knows what expression Yukino would have when she saw Shin's curt response, probably like a teacher seeing a red mark on the summer homework they had painstakingly graded. To be continued. Chapter 18, The Next Step in the Dragon Ball World. After immersing himself in the dream, Shin did not immediately appear in the Dragon Ball world. Instead, he found himself in darkness, where a special pop-up window appeared. Dear Zuke, please select the mission world you want to enter. 1. Dragon Ball. This was obviously an interface for choosing a mission world, but currently, only the Dragon Ball world was available. Shin still had no idea how to unlock the second world. Based on the current timeline he observed in the Dragon Ball world, it seemed unlikely that he would be able to significantly improve his soul and mental strength in the short term. However, the physical combat power in the Dragon Ball world was undeniably strong, which Shin found quite satisfying. Nevertheless, Shin had mixed feelings about the Dragon Ball world. He loved it because the overall level of the world was high, and having randomly acquired the identity of a Saiyan, he had practically reached new heights, possessing combat power far beyond the reach of the real world. The downside was that if the method to unlock the second world involved completing the main storyline of the first world, it would essentially trap Shin. I can only hope that unlocking the second world is a bit easier, he sighed, feeling somewhat uncertain about his future. He chose to enter the Dragon Ball world since there were no other worlds available. In the next moment, the darkness before his eyes vanished, and he found himself back in the forest, specifically, the same forest he was in when he exited the game last time. Transitioning to Zuke. The cave created by a ki blast, where he had disposed of Elek's remains, was still at his feet. Realizing his location hadn't changed since his last exit, Zuke immediately suppressed his ki, lowering his combat power to the minimum. Sure enough, a beam of light soon swept over from a distance. A large lighting device was scanning the surroundings and just happened to illuminate his location. Peeking out, Zuke looked toward the distance. What was once a city of the Cerealians was now completely in ruins, with a large group of Frisia's army personnel cleaning up the area. Frisia's business involved selling these planets to interested aliens. Since they were commodities, their appearance was important, and the ruins needed to be cleaned up. Zuke was aware of this, so he suppressed his ki right away. This way, even if someone from Frisia's army unintentionally detected him with a scouter, they would only see a combat power in the double digits. A combat power in the double digits was akin to that of a large beast on some planets, something the Frisia army wouldn't care about. After all, they were not exterminating the entire biosphere, just the human civilization. No one would want to buy a planet that didn't even have animals on it. However, the ones moving through the city ruins were not only members of Frisia's army. There was also another group. These individuals were dressed differently, showing a lack of discipline. They didn't follow the orders of Frisia's army but rather took commands from a small, blue-skinned woman with dreadlocks. Just from her hairstyle and skin color, it was easy to tell that this woman was from the same race as Elek. Zuke recognized her. She was Maki, a member of the Heater family like Elek. The disappearance of Elek, the leader of the Heaters, on Planet Seral was a major event for the Heater family, prompting Maki to search for his whereabouts. Unlike Frisia, the Heater family, although also involved in business throughout the universe, did not have their own armed forces. They relied on mercenaries from across the universe. As long as they paid well, there were always people willing to work for them. Frisia clearly wasn't ready to break ties with the Heater family, so he didn't mind them hiring mercenaries to search Planet Seral. Thus, there were two groups on Planet Seral, a large number of mercenaries hired by the Heater family and Frisia's army personnel, who were carrying out their respective tasks with minimal interaction. Good, just as I expected. Zuke was pleased with the situation. This was precisely within his predictions after eliminating Elek. The two groups mingling together worked to Shin's advantage because it meant that if someone suddenly took off in a spaceship, each side would assume it was the other acting independently. Frisia's soldiers looked down on the mercenaries, while the mercenaries had no respect for Frisia's army. The lack of communication made it easy for Zuke to slip away unnoticed. Maintaining his suppressed combat power, Zuke quickly found the landing site for Frisia's spherical spaceships nearby, where the ground was covered in craters left by the ships. No one was even guarding them. To Frisia's army, these spherical ships probably weren't considered particularly valuable. This was convenient for Zuke, who chose one that appeared relatively new, opened the hatch, and climbed inside, immediately pulling out the tracking system. This tracking system allowed Frisia's headquarters to locate the ship's position. Zuke had learned about it yesterday from a logistics officer responsible for maintaining the ships, who had divulged the information without hesitation. After all, in Frisia's army, combat personnel had a much higher status than logistics staff. Though Scions were often derogatorily called monkeys in Frisia's army, the logistics officer did not dare to defy Zuke's questioning. Zuke had already prepared to leave Frisia's army before yesterday's departure, so he had thoroughly investigated these details. He threw the tracking device outside the spaceship, closed the hatch, and began setting the destination. Stored in the ship's computer were coordinates for several significant planets collected by Frisia's army. Once the destination was set, the spherical ship would automatically navigate there. Among these coordinates, Zuke soon found the one he needed. Planet Zuno. As the name suggests, it was the residence of Zuno, the famed information master in the universe, reputed to know almost everything, even the location of the Super Dragon Balls. He was essentially a more advanced version of fortune-teller Baba. Zuno was Zuke's next target. Since Zuno was known for his information services, Zuke had speculated that the coordinates for his planet would be among Frisia's records, and it turned out to be true. Of course, if the coordinates weren't there, Zuke had a backup plan, obtaining them from the Heater family. As fellow information merchants, they would surely have a way to find Zuno. But it turned out to be unnecessary. As for the cost of Zuno's information services, according to the original story, one had to offer him a kiss, and Zuno would decide the number of questions based on his impression of the kisser. This setup was undoubtedly Toriyama Akira's quirky humor, but in reality, it wasn't just a matter of eccentricity. Zuke had no intention of kissing Zuno. He had already decided that if Zuno refused to answer, he would resort to force. Zuno himself had little combat power. His rules might work for those who played by them, but for someone strong and unruly, there wasn't much Zuno could do. In the original story, Zamasu from Universe 10 had once violently coerced Zuno into providing information about the Super Dragon Balls. If Zamasu could do it, why couldn't Zuke? To be continued. Chapter 19, The Special Distress Signal. After setting the destination to Planet Zuno, the spherical spaceship immediately launched, slowly ascending into the sky and gradually accelerating as it departed from Planet Seral. As Zuke expected, no one paid any attention to the spaceship's departure. Even if a few people saw it, they would likely assume that someone was acting independently. The mercenaries of the Sita clan might think that someone from Frisia's army had some task to handle, while Frisia's forces would assume it was a Sita clan mercenary taking a solo action using their ship. After all, the Sita clan's ships were large, typically carrying many people. For individual actions, borrowing a single-person spherical ship from Frisia's army was the only option. Spherical ships weren't particularly valuable within Frisia's forces. Many were destroyed on missions, especially by Scions, who would often crush the ships after transforming into great apes. Thus, Frisia's troops weren't concerned about someone taking off with a ship. They could track it using the onboard locator system and recover it anytime. Naturally, they had no idea that Zuke had already dismantled the tracking device before launching. No one's following. Good. After the ship launched, Zuke kept his eyes on the view outside through the spherical ship's window. Even when they reached space, no one had come after him, indicating that his escape was indeed successful. However, the time needed to reach Planet Zuno is ridiculous. Although it was fortunate that no one noticed Zuke stealing the spherical ship, the estimated travel time displayed on the small screen was disheartening. The screen showed 21,514 tacks remaining. Tacks were a universal time unit in space. Zuke recalled that 100 tacks were roughly equivalent to 48 minutes on Earth. In other words, it would take a full 7 days to travel from here to Planet Zuno. Zuke felt somewhat helpless. Crossing the distance between planets was, after all, a significant journey, and the speed of Frisia's spherical ships was already quite fast. Even so, several days of travel couldn't be avoided. For a small planet like Earth, located on the outer edge of the universe, traveling there would take nearly a year. At least Planet Zuno was in a more central, bustling region, so the journey wouldn't be as long. It seemed that Planet Seral's proximity had given Zuke a misleading impression that interplanetary travel didn't take much time, as it had only taken a few hours to reach there. Fortunately, each time I log out of the game and re-enter, I appear in a relative position. Zuke was relieved that he always reappeared in a relative position in the world, rather than an absolute one. This meant he didn't have to worry about logging out in the spaceship and reappearing in the vacuum of space upon re-entering. But still, does this mean I'll be stuck in this cramped spaceship for 7 days? There's not even a single entertainment facility in here. Although there was no risk of appearing in open space upon logging in, Zuke was indeed stuck with nothing to do in the ship. As seen from Vegeta and Nappa's conversation in the original work, the only thing to do inside a spherical spaceship was to use the sleep pod, which at least allowed people to pass the long travel time unconsciously. But Zuke definitely wasn't going to hibernate. He didn't need to sit inside the spaceship for 7 full days when he could log out after 8 hours and return to the real world. The spherical ship's interior was very cramped, forcing Zuke to sit in a curled-up position, without room to stretch his limbs. Sitting in such conditions for 8 hours would be truly unbearable. This is where the benefits of having a second world show. Zuke sighed. If he could access a second world right now, he could train there for 7 days, allowing the spaceship to travel on its own. When it was close to the destination, he could then return to the Dragonball world, reappearing inside the spaceship without wasting 7 days. However, now that the spaceship was already in motion, there was nothing he could do. He resigned himself to his fate. In that case, I might as well just log out. He wasn't interested in staying in this confined space for 8 hours before logging out. The log out option was now a permanent feature on his interface, allowing him to exit the game anytime. He planned to log back into the Dragonball world in 7 days, by which time he should have already arrived at Planet Zuno. But just as Zuke was about to log out, a new message suddenly flashed across the spaceship's screen. Zuke paused and looked at the screen, which displayed a simple message indicating that a nearby planet had been detected with a Frisia Force spaceship sending a distress signal. Judging by the distress signal, the Frisia Force ship appeared to have suffered severe damage. Another Frisia Force ship nearby sending a distress signal. Zuke rubbed his chin, intrigued. It wasn't common for the Frisia Force to issue a distress signal. Was something unusual happening? Could it be Broly and his father? If the world Zuke was in followed the canonical timeline, then Broly and his father would indeed exist. Given that Bardock's son was just born, Broly should have been born already as well. Broly was exiled to the inhospitable planet Vampa by King Vegeta shortly after birth for exhibiting terrifying growth potential. His father, Paragus, followed him there. I've never heard of Planet Vampa being near Planet Seral. Should I go check it out? However, the possibility that this distress signal came from Broly and Paragus wasn't high. After all, Paragus held a grudge against King Vegeta and distrusted Frisia's forces due to Broly's exile. In such a situation, sending a distress signal that could alert the Frisia force would be a suicidal move. Since the specifics were unknown, why not take a look? After all, the next 7 days would be a long journey, so he might as well find something to do before the lengthy flight. The planet sending the distress signal wasn't far from Zuke. Changing course would take only 1 or 2 hours, which was acceptable. After confirming the target, Zuke set the new flight path for the spaceship and turned toward the planet emitting the distress signal, prepared to see what was happening there. Even if danger arose, he could use instant transmission to escape, which gave him the confidence to investigate. To be continued. Chapter 20, Babidi and Majin Buu. Curiosity is indeed a fine thing. The first time in a spherical spaceship, a few hours felt fine, but the second time, even an hour or 2 felt excruciatingly boring. As the spaceship smoothly landed, Zuke emerged from the cabin with a lifeless expression. He'd been so bored during that 1 to 2 hours that he had actually fallen asleep. Dr. Brief's original suggestion in the series about adding entertainment facilities to Goku's spaceship was spot on. The lack of any recreational activities during long flights was painfully unbearable. Even someone as obsessed with training as Goku would need at least a bit of space to move around. This spherical spaceship required the whole body to be cramped inside, which felt almost inhumane. But after landing, Zuke got a sense of this planet's general situation. Different from his earlier guess, this wasn't Planet Vampa but a planet without a name, known only by its numerical designation. Based on the information available from the spaceship, this planet seemed to host a vast population of wild beasts with considerable combat power. Non-combat personnel would likely be at risk of being devoured by these creatures. Zuke took out his combat power detector, put it on, and scanned the surroundings. As expected, he saw numerous combat power readings in the distance, mostly large beasts, judging by the detector's outlines. The combat power of these beasts wasn't low either. Quite a few of them surpassed a power level of 1000, which, if on Earth, would be devastating enough to threaten human civilization. Although these beasts have decent combat power, it shouldn't be enough to make Frisia's army issue a distress signal, right? Despite their remarkable combat power, Zuke couldn't quite understand why the Frisia soldiers here would need to request rescue. Usually, Frisia's soldiers travel with combat personnel. Even if they couldn't eliminate all the beasts here, they should at least be able to escape. But soon enough, Zuke noticed something else on his combat detector. A few high-power signals appeared in the distance. And judging by their outline, they weren't beasts. Could it be Frisia's men? Zuke aimed the detector in that direction and activated the power level viewer, and the numbers on the lens began to skyrocket. In an instant, the combat power reading surged past 10,000, prompting Zuke to quickly shut off the detector. It wasn't the numbers that startled him but the fact that he knew the upper limit of the detector he was wearing was about 20,000. If it went beyond that, the detector might explode. This was his only combat power detector, so he couldn't afford to let it blow up. Over 10,000 combat power? No, judging by the rate at which that number was rising, it's likely astronomical in the end, perhaps even stronger than Frisia himself. Where did this monster come from? Zuke muttered under his breath, surprised to find a creature with such combat power on this planet. Despite his words, Zuke lowered his power level and cautiously moved in the direction of the source. Though it was risky, he was already here, he couldn't leave without at least seeing who possessed this power. Otherwise, this trip would have been for nothing. Even if he ended up with no substantial gain, at the very least, he'd know who was here. Due to suppressing his energy, Zuke's speed slowed, but he still managed to reach the destination after about 10 minutes. Hiding behind a large rock, Zuke carefully peeked out at the scene ahead. Just up ahead was a large clearing, where a strange structure stood prominently. Upon closer inspection, he noticed 4 pillars supporting the structure, so it was actually a spaceship. This spaceship is enormous. Could Frisia's army's distress signal have something to do with it? Zuke scrutinized the spaceship, deep in thought. The overwhelming power level he sensed earlier likely originated from within. He combed through his memories of Dragonball, trying to recall a spaceship of this design but came up blank. There must be another clue. Zuke examined the spaceship closely again and finally spotted a familiar mark carved into one of its corners. It was an ornate M symbol. He hadn't noticed it right away since it was tucked away in a corner, but now that he saw it, he immediately realized what it was. It was Babidi's spaceship. Zuke suddenly understood. In the original series, Babidi had buried his spaceship underground, leaving only an entrance exposed. That explained why he hadn't recognized the design. So Babidi was already planning to resurrect Majin Buu. His presence here must be to collect the energy of these wild beasts, right? To revive Majin Buu, Babidi traveled across the universe, gathering the strength of powerful beings to inject it into Majin Buu's egg for resurrection. This explains the Frisia soldiers' distress signal. Some of Frisia's men likely wandered onto this planet and ended up captured by Babidi's forces, triggering the signal. After sending the distress call, it's likely they didn't survive. Babidi isn't exactly merciful, he wouldn't hesitate to kill. As for the terrifying combat power source, it's likely Babidi's henchman, Dabura, the king of the demon realm. Dabura's strength at this time was practically unmatched, belonging to the later stages of the series. Even if Frisia were to use his full 100% power, he'd be instantly defeated by Dabura. Dabura, Majin Buu. Zuke frowned. Facing Dabura head-on right now wasn't an option. Not only was there no benefit to him, but Dabura would likely consider him as trivial as an ant. In fact, there was a way to increase his strength here by having Babidi awaken his inner evil, allowing him to enter a Majin state and gain some power. However, the cost would be coming under Babidi's control. Although Babidi's control wasn't absolute, as demonstrated by the Earth warrior Yamu, who once temporarily resisted Babidi's influence and fear after his companion was killed. But even minor control was still control. Zuke wasn't willing to accept even a small increase in power if it meant being under Babidi's thumb. To be continued. Chapter 21, Unlocking the Second World. Although I can't gain much from Babidi, Dabura, or Majin Buu, causing some trouble for Frisia is definitely within my reach. Moving away from Babidi's spaceship, Zuke soon found several other spherical ships from Frisia's army nearby. Just as he anticipated, these ships had been blasted open from the outside, seemingly ambushed by Babidi's minions as soon as they landed, and captured right away. The likely scenario was that they hurriedly activated their distress signals before getting seized, drained of their energy, and then disposed of. These rushed distress signals could only be picked up by nearby ships. However, there was also a signal meant for the Frisia force's headquarters, which apparently hadn't been sent from these ships. Well, let me help you send it. Zuke entered the ships and activated their specific signal transmitters, making sure Frisia's headquarters would receive the signal. Soon, Frisia's forces would send a squad to investigate, ultimately clashing with Babidi's minions. With Dabura on Babidi's side, a decisive victory for Babidi was inevitable. However, some level of destruction in battle would be unavoidable. This might, to some extent, delay Babidi's plan to resurrect Majin Buu. As for whether Frisia would come here himself and end up being killed by Dabura, Zuke wasn't particularly concerned about that. When Frisia inherited his father's empire, he'd been warned that there were two individuals he should never provoke in the universe. One was Majin Buu, and the other was the god of destruction Beerus. As long as Frisia figured out it was Babidi resurrecting Majin Buu, he'd likely back off to avoid losses. Although it might not pose a serious threat to Frisia, simply frustrating him was a good outcome. After all, Frisia was holding up Zuke's main storyline task. After confirming that the distress signal had indeed been sent to Frisia's headquarters, Zuke left, satisfied. Lingering too long might lead to discovery by Babidi's forces. Given his current strength, if a fight broke out, he could only rely on instant transmission to escape. Moreover, if the ship got destroyed in battle, he'd be trapped on this planet. Surviving in space was out of the question. It was ironic how, despite gaining powers that could threaten the universe, Saiyan still couldn't survive in space, and were even vulnerable to heart disease. Many criticized these high attack, low survival characteristics of Saiyans. Controlling the spaceship again, Zuke departed from the planet. This time, he was truly heading toward Zuno's planet and wouldn't stop unless he encountered a notable place like Planet Vampa. Yet, as soon as he left, a system notification sounded in his mind. Congratulations, dear Zuke. You've achieved the first step of synchronization. A new task world has been confirmed and recorded. An achievement. Just like in a game, Zuke thought, already about to log out, but stopped in surprise. Because the second notification stated that a new task world had been confirmed and recorded. In other words, the second world was now unlocked, meaning he didn't need to complete the main quest of the first world to progress, as he'd initially feared. And the name of this achievement was the first step of synchronization, which reminded him of. Zuke quickly opened his status panel, and sure enough, there was a slight change. Current world, Dragonball. Main task, defeat Frisia at 100% power. Player Zuke's synchronization status, 1%. Advance the main task to unlock further synchronization. The sync rate had gone from 0% to 1%. Although small, this 1% represented a genuine first step in synchronization according to the system. The previous 0.5% sync didn't seem to count as progress. Why would synchronization increase? Does the system see my recent actions as advancing the main quest? While happy about the panel changes and the second world's unlock, Zuke was puzzled by the sync rate increase. According to the panel, advancing the main quest was the only way to unlock synchronization. Did his recent actions qualify as working toward defeating Frisia? In his view, all he'd done was give Frisia's army some trouble. It had little to do with actually defeating Frisia. If merely defeating Frisia were the goal, Zuke had even considered luring Frisia to Dabura and letting him do the job. However, he suspected the system required him to personally defeat Frisia, so he held back on that plan. If Dabura did kill Frisia, but the main quest didn't count it as completion, would he even keep his synchronization progress? Can't make sense of it, but progress is always good. He pondered a bit but couldn't figure out how his actions were seen as main quest progress. Since the system said so, he wasn't about to argue. This system might lack true intelligence, but if he voiced his doubts and it fixed the so-called bug by rolling back his progress, he'd be devastated. Moreover, unlocking a second world was a timely relief for him. Over the next 7 days in the Dragon Ball world, he'd be stuck on the ship, and with a second world, he could spend that time in another task world. Perhaps, any powers gained in the second world might even help his progress in the Dragon Ball world. Aside from that, Earth in the Dragon Ball world was a place he definitely wanted to visit. However, traveling there on a spherical spaceship would take a year, which was way too long. Until he found a faster way to reach Earth, he wouldn't consider it for now. In the worst case, he still had 2 Dragon Balls. They were petrified now, but after a year, they'd return to normal. Using them to transport himself to Earth was an option. Even though the power of the 2-star Dragon Ball had disappointed him greatly, he didn't expect much from that dragon. The Earth's Dragon Balls, however, created by the name Kean Guardian, were said to be superior, so he anticipated them more. Well then, let's log out and check the second world. Although he hadn't gained power on Babidi's planet, advancing his synchronization made it worthwhile. Now, he was eager to see what the second world held. If nothing unexpected happened, he'd spend his next 7 days of sleep in the second world. To be continued. It is a new story, guys, so please donate your power stones. I wish that the FIC reaches to a maximum number of audience. Chapter 22, Ways to Enhance Spiritual Power. Unlike the previous times he left the game, Zuke didn't wake up directly on his bed this time. Instead, he found himself enveloped in darkness. In the darkness, the world selection option once again appeared before Zuke. Dear Zuke, please choose the mission world you wish to enter. 1. Dragon Ball. 2. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. So the second world is actually that one, huh? Zuke was a bit surprised. He originally assumed the second world would be similar to Dragon Ball, likely a world with high combat power, but he hadn't expected it to be JoJo. How to put it, the world in that series is vastly different from Dragon Ball. Even in the early stages, Dragon Ball's storyline casually includes destroying the moon, and later, threats to blow up Earth become almost routine. Just thinking about it sends chills down your spine. Meanwhile, in JoJo, aside from the cosmic reset incident with Pucci in Part 6, it's mostly a supernatural series set in a city, with limits like demolishing a building or causing street damage. Frankly, Zuke wouldn't even need his 4000 power level from the Dragon Ball world, his current 40 power level from the real world. Oh no, he realized, it's 40 now, would suffice for similar effects. But there's something in this world that the Dragon Ball world can't quite offer, and that's the enhancement of spirit and soul. Yes, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure features a power called the Stand, which is a manifestation of spiritual power and a symbol of the soul. In Dragon Ball, it would be difficult for Zuke to improve his spirit and soul in a short time, but in the JoJo world, that could be easily achieved. One way to awaken a stand is to be struck by the special arrow from the series, which instantly grants one a stand without any complicated steps or high costs. Though, if the stand doesn't awaken, you might die. Zuke wasn't too worried about that, though, even if he did die, he'd only lose access to that mission world, which he could afford. After all, the biggest advantage of this world is that it offers him an opportunity for mental and spiritual evolution. In terms of raw power, Dragon Ball is still simpler and more direct. Well, let's try out this new mission world. Thinking too much here wouldn't change anything, so Zuke decided to jump in and see the situation. He directly selected the second mission world. Then the system immediately showed a message that made Zuke speechless. Dear Zuke, you have 0 plays left for today. Please try again tomorrow. So I can only enter 1 mission world per day. Zuke scratched his head. The message was clear enough, since he had already entered the Dragon Ball world today, he had used up his remaining entries and couldn't access the second mission world. But since there was a set limit on play entries, there must be a way to increase it, though Zuke didn't know how yet. This system claims to be a game, yet many of its mechanics require him to figure things out step by step without a tutorial or guide, which made Zuke want to vent a bit. If this were in the real world and people saw this design, the developer would have been fired long ago. Though he couldn't enter the second mission world, the system did present the main quest for JoJo, giving Chin Chuan some insight into the world ahead of time. Current world, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Main quest, defeat Dio. Player, Zuke's power synchronization, 0%. Please advance the main quest to unlock power synchronization. Dio, the boss in the first and third parts of JoJo's bizarre adventure, is a key character across parts 1 through 6. Among fans, some jokingly call the series Dio's bizarre social life. Zuke wasn't concerned with that, though. What he cared more about was which version of Dio he'd encounter, the Dio from part 1 or the Dio from part 3. There's a big difference between parts 1 and 3. The stand power that Zuke wanted only appears starting in part 3. In contrast, the protagonists of parts 1 and 2 use ripple breathing, a technique that enhances physical power through a unique breathing rhythm, generating solar-like energy. Honestly, with 40 power level in reality, Zuke wasn't particularly interested in the ripple breathing technique. Sure, it has anti-aging effects, but Zuke didn't urgently need that benefit right now. As for its vampire-killing ability, he didn't need that either, there were no vampires in his world. And he doubted it would work on the spirits seen by Miko Yotsuya, since ripple breathing mimics solar energy, and those spirits roam around in broad daylight without any issue. Using a stand would be much more effective against them. Defeat Dio. I hope it's the Dio from part 3, otherwise, the part 1 timeline is pretty much useless for me. For now, Zuke could only hope that when he entered the mission world, he'd land in the timeline of part 3, so he could obtain a stand with minimal fuss. Of course, there was also a worst-case scenario, that he would end up in the part 2 timeline. In that case, Dio wouldn't even be dead yet, he'd be locked in a coffin, sleeping at the bottom of the sea for decades until he's eventually dredged up. If that happened, Zuke would have no way to kill him. He couldn't very well go diving into the ocean on the off chance of finding Dio's coffin, right? I'll have to wait until tomorrow to enter the JoJo world and make plans then. Zuke thought his luck couldn't be that bad, and after hesitating a bit, he closed the system. On a side note, he regretted naming himself Zuke when he created his account yesterday. Now, every system message addressed him as Zuke, and hearing it repeatedly was starting to feel like an insult. It couldn't be helped, when the system first claimed to be an infinite horror VR game, the only thing that came to mind was a team-based PvP. He thought he could obscure his identity a bit, hence the silly name, not knowing he'd end up being the sole player in the world, making his alias pointless. Anyway, once he acquires a stand in the JoJo world and enhances his spirit and soul, he'll be able to deal with the surrounding evil spirits. Even though he couldn't see them yet, just knowing they existed made him feel uneasy. To be continued. It is a new story, guys, so please donate your power stones. I wish that the FIC reaches to a maximum number of audience. Author notes, Tamiyama Saiyan is just an original side character, like Akagi, created to interact with the main female characters. I double-checked to ensure there's no overlap with characters from any obscure anime. Although I'm a rookie, I'll avoid any divisive tropes like shipping wars. Feel free to give suggestions, I'll strive to improve. Chapter 23, Witness Megumi Kato. Transitioning to Shin. The next morning, when Shin arrived at the classroom, he found that Megumi Kato was already there. The classroom wasn't very crowded yet, as Shin had come fairly early. The students who had arrived ahead of him were mostly gathered in small groups chatting, leaving Megumi Kato alone at her seat, going over her lessons. On the one hand, this showed that Megumi Kato was a studious girl. On the other hand, it highlighted her low presence, few people seemed to notice her enough to strike up a conversation. But Megumi seemed used to it, quietly studying on her own as though nothing was amiss. "Good morning, Kato." Shin greeted her as he sat down at his desk, since no one else was talking to her, he might as well fill that role. After all, Megumi Kato was quite a beauty, and chatting with her was far from unpleasant. "Ah. Good morning, Ran-kun." Megumi gave a small start, almost as though Shin's greeting had surprised her. She turned to look at him, her expression slightly taken aback. Although Megumi always appeared calm, she was far from expressionless, her emotions were still clearly discernible. Of course, Shin suspected her calm expression was due to her low presence, without people to talk to, she probably saw little need to show a wide range of emotions. If Megumi Kato kept up this isolated routine, he wondered, would she actually become expressionless in a few years? "Why do you look so startled? Am I that scary?" Shin chuckled as he pulled a textbook out of his bag and placed it on the desk. "No, it's just. I didn't expect you to notice me today as well. I thought yesterday was an exception." Megumi shook her head, her gaze filled with curiosity at Shin's continued attention. Yesterday's brief conversation with him had been enough to satisfy her, but now it seemed he might talk to her regularly from now on. You said it yourself, didn't you? That we should talk more. Shin recalled Megumi's words from yesterday. Now that he had developed the ability to sense energy, Megumi's low presence no longer affected him. That was just polite talk. Megumi's expression softened slightly, though at a glance, she still seemed as composed as ever. A closer look revealed a small smile at the corners of her lips. She was rather cute. Though Megumi wasn't the kind of girl who took one's breath away, she had a unique charm. If you talk to me often, though, Yukino Shita might get jealous. Yukino Shita. Shin blinked in mild surprise at Megumi's sudden mention of Yukino Shita. Yukino. Why bring her up? Aren't you dating Yukino Shita? Megumi looked at Shin curiously, her eyes shining with a thirst for knowledge. Where did you hear that? Shin's mouth twitched. He'd only met Yukino Shita for the first time yesterday. How did Megumi already know about their interaction? Had rumors about him and Yukino Shita spread so quickly? That couldn't be, could it? They'd only met after school yesterday, and already this morning Megumi knew about it. It wasn't like the soccer team members had stayed up all night spreading gossip, was it? I saw you with her by the field after school yesterday. You looked quite close. In fact, Megumi hadn't heard any rumors, she had seen it firsthand. Did I misunderstand something? Oh, that. I was just helping a friend with his romantic pursuit. Shin realized why Megumi thought he and Yukino Shita had something going on. You probably know him, Akagi. He asked me to go with him to the service club yesterday. Shin went on to explain how Akagi had dragged him to the service club, where Yukino Shita had enlisted their help to set up Akagi with Tamiya Saiyan. Oh, the service club. I see. I didn't expect Yukino Shita to have that side of her. After hearing his explanation, Megumi understood what had happened and gained a new perspective on Yukino Shita. Yukino. As a self-proclaimed, ordinary student, Megumi had heard of Yukino Shita, the high-achieving, beautiful girl, but she hadn't known about Yukino Shita's helpful nature. However, her approach to helping others. Megumi, despite her lack of romantic experience, sensed that Yukino Shita's plan might not be very reliable, much like Shin. Do you have any suggestions, Kato? You could tell me, and I'll pass them on to Yukino Shita. Noticing Megumi's discomfort after hearing Yukino Shita's plan, Shin could tell she found it less than reliable. Leaving two shy people alone together and expecting romance to blossom was the kind of thing that only happened in manga. Well, I mean, people without any dating experience wouldn't have much useful advice to offer, would they? Megumi pondered Shin's request but, realizing she had nothing to offer, could only express her own helplessness. After all, none of them, Shin, Yukino Shita, or herself, had any dating experience, so they weren't really qualified to give Akagi or Tamiya advice on love. Of course, Shin and Megumi were aware of this limitation, while Yukino Shita had a mysterious confidence in her plan. But it's admirable that you're willing to help your friend, Ransacking. Megumi smiled at Shin, giving him a small compliment. After all, he wasn't part of the service club, he was only involved because Akagi was his friend. To Megumi, that was praiseworthy. It's just a small favor. Plus, if Akagi has a girlfriend, maybe he'll settle down a bit. Shin shook his head, thinking it was no big deal. Akagi had done plenty of silly things in the past to meet the school's well-known beauties, so if he could actually start dating Tamiya Saiyan, she might keep him from causing trouble. What about you, Ransacking? Have you thought about getting a girlfriend? With the topic turning to dating, Megumi blinked curiously, looking at Shin. To be continued. It is a new story, guys, so please donate your power stones. I wish that the FIC reaches to a maximum number of audience. Chapter 24, Atmosphere is Key. Megumi Kato's sudden question caught Shin off guard. It wasn't that he was narcissistic enough to think that just a few conversations would make her fall for him. He simply hadn't considered this kind of question before. As for dating, he put it off while waiting for his system to load. So, even when girls had confessed, he had gently turned them down. But now that his system was fully loaded and he understood its true nature, he could even harness its power to become stronger and live a better life. In that context, having a girlfriend didn't seem like a problem anymore. Yet, before Shin could respond to Kato's question, Akaji's loud voice interrupted their conversation. Shin. Are you joining me at the service club again today? Akaji's shout shattered the moment between him and Kato, causing Shin to show a look of mild annoyance. This guy really needed to find a girl to rein him in. Pfft. Kato giggled at his expression, gave him a playful wink, and then walked off, leaving him and Akaji some space. It had to be said that Megumi Kato was indeed a kind-hearted girl, quiet, tactful, and mindful of others' space. Though the conversation had been interrupted, Shin thought that if he were to date someone, Megumi Kato might actually be a good choice. But since Kato seemed to have stepped back, Shin turned to Akaji with an air of distaste in his tone. What do you need to go to the service club for again? Didn't you go yesterday? Of course he felt reluctant. Talking to a loud guy like Akaji couldn't compare to the comfort of chatting with a sweet girl like Kato. Akaji, however, was oblivious to the fact he'd disrupted Shin's conversation. Kato's low-key presence had once again come through, and Akaji hadn't even noticed Shin talking to someone else. Of course, I need Yukino advice for my plans. Akaji looked at Shin with a puzzled expression, as if he'd said something absurd. Didn't you tell me Yukino would help me make a plan to get along with Saiyan? Shin fell silent at Akaji's words. It seemed that Yukino was quite confident in her plans, and Akaji trusted her too. Then again, Akaji practically idolized all the famous girls at school, so it wasn't surprising he'd have blind faith in them. Who knows, if he found out Irie was a doujin artist, it might shatter his idealized image of her. Your relationship isn't even close yet, and you're already calling her Saiyan so eagerly. Shin felt slightly exasperated seeing how eager Akaji was. He hadn't even exchanged a word with Tamiya Saiyan yet, but was already addressing her so casually. It's fine to do that here, but if you actually meet her, don't call her by her first name, it'll seem impolite. In Japanese culture, only people who are close call each other by their first names. Using surnames or full names is standard otherwise. If Akaji, a high schooler, called Saiyan by her first name unprompted, it would definitely come off as rude. Even though Yukino's plan might be iffy, Akaji wouldn't have a chance if he managed to drop his favorability score into the negatives right from the start. Don't worry, I know. Akaji patted his chest confidently, but then looked at Shin with a hopeful gleam in his eyes. So, after school, could you come with me to the service club? Although he could go alone, after seeing how Shin and Yukino had hit it off yesterday, he felt it would be better to have Shin there with him. At least Shin seemed comfortable talking to Yukino, while Akaji felt he would be too nervous. No need. Yukino already sent me the plan. Shin waved him off, feeling there was no need to go back. After all, Yukino had her own responsibilities at the service club. It wouldn't be right to disturb her every day. He and Akaji weren't even members of the club, so constantly visiting wouldn't be appropriate. But just as he finished speaking, he noticed Akaji staring at him in amazement. Before Shin could respond, Akaji lowered his voice and asked in shock. You exchanged contact info with Yukino. Shin was momentarily stunned before realizing what he'd implied. Yesterday, when they parted, he'd told Akaji that Yukino would come up with a plan and share it later. Now, he'd just mentioned she'd already sent it over. So the conclusion was obvious: either Yukino had visited Shin's house last night, or they'd exchanged contact info. Otherwise, how could she have sent him the plan? For once, you're not as clueless as usual, Shin said, feigning exasperation. Yes, we just exchanged contacts. Don't read too much into it. I understand, I won't spread rumors. Akaji nodded, a look of, I know everything but I'll play along, on his face. Clearly, with his heart set on dating Tamiya Saiyan, he now saw similar prospects for Shin and Yukino. But since he'd promised not to gossip, Shin trusted him. Though Akaji could be simple-minded, he was a good person. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so well-liked in class. Well, since Yukino already sent you the plan, I guess there's no need to go to the service club today. Akaji, though usually eager to see the famous girls around school, seemed to have mellowed now that he was focused on pursuing Saiyan. He didn't insist on seeing Yukino again. And Shin's point was valid. Yukino hadn't started the service club just to help him with dating advice. They couldn't hog all her time. All right then. Let's chat more over lunch, and you can show me the plan then. As they talked, Akaji saw the teacher walking into the classroom, signaling the start of class. Naturally, he couldn't linger around Shin any longer, so with a quick wave, he dashed to his seat. To be continued, Chapter 25, Megumi Kato's Contact Information. On the podium, Shizuka Hiratsuka was giving a Japanese language lecture, and most of the students below were listening intently. One reason was that exams were approaching, and even some of the procrastinators were making a final push. Another reason was that Hiratsuka, a teacher who genuinely cared about her students, also enforced her iron rule, earning both respect and fear from many students who dared not drift off. As an ordinary student, Shin was also paying his usual close attention to the lecture. However, midway through the class, Megumi Kato, who was seated in front of him, suddenly turned around, placed a small note on Shin's desk, and then naturally turned back. Shin? For a moment, Shin didn't register it. Was Megumi passing him a note in class? Passing notes was fairly common among students, but Megumi. Her action was rather conspicuous. She turned her entire body to place the note. Unless the teacher was blind, she'd easily see it, right? Instinctively, Shin glanced at Hiratsuka on the podium, who seemed to sense his movement and gave him a look. From Hiratsuka's brief gaze, Shin could tell her message: don't get distracted, pay attention to class. Alright, since Hiratsuka hadn't noticed, Shin couldn't rat Megumi out. Using his ability to sense ki, he subtly opened the note while tracking Hiratsuka's movements. With his current sensory abilities, he could detect every movement Hiratsuka made through her ki, allowing him to perfectly avoid her gaze. The note from Megumi Kato didn't contain anything complicated, it simply had her contact information on it. It was obvious that she had overheard Shin's conversation with Akaji before class and learned that he and Yukino Shida had already exchanged contacts. For whatever reason, she also wanted to add him as a contact. After all, Shin was the only one who consistently noticed her presence. It was only natural that she wanted to talk with him more. Not overthinking it, Shin took out his phone and added Megumi's contact under the desk. To Shin's surprise, Megumi immediately accepted the request and even sent a smile emoji in return. Shin looked at her back in front of him. She was sitting perfectly straight. Had he not seen her message, he would never have guessed she was secretly using her phone in class. Megumi. You're breaking the rules, playing with your phone in class. Finding it amusing, Shin also evaded Hiratsuka's gaze and replied to Megumi. Focus on the class. But Shin, aren't you secretly using your phone too? My grades are better than yours, though. Indeed, while Shin aimed for a quiet, unassuming life, his academic performance was still above average in his year. Compared to Megumi, who was generally mid-level, he was indeed doing slightly better, though just a bit. Using grades to bully me, huh? Maybe because of the texting app, Shin could somehow sense a slight teasing tone in her words. Then again, it made sense. Megumi's usual tone was always calm, making it hard to gauge her emotions. If she'd spoken the same words aloud, the teasing feeling probably wouldn't have come through. Of course, it could just be Shin's imagination. He didn't want to fall victim to the three great illusions of life. You can just call me Megumi. Shortly after, Megumi sent another message, one that carried a bit more weight. Shin knew why she said this. She had overheard Akaji casually calling Saiyan Tamiya by her first name. But to let him call her by her first name. Did Megumi already see him as a close friend? Then you should drop the Ransacking too. Shin certainly didn't mind becoming closer friends with Megumi, but her formal way of addressing him was a bit distant. So. Shinu-chan. Megumi, maybe you should consider keeping a little distance. Shin felt somewhat helpless. Ever since Megumi realized she could interact normally with him, it was like her sense of personal space had vanished. While it wasn't bad to get closer to a pretty girl, he was slightly worried that her lack of boundaries might get her into trouble one day. Don't worry. Besides Shin-chan, nobody else even notices me. Megumi's response had a subtle sadness. Though she was likely used to being ignored, these words still evoked a hint of pity. Shin wasn't overly concerned with how others viewed him, but when he thought of Megumi's usual situation, he couldn't help but feel a chill. Alright, I understand. I'll talk with you more from now on. Shin figured Megumi must feel a bit lonely and wanted to get closer to him as someone who could notice her. But Shin didn't mind. After all, how many people would love the chance to get closer to a pretty girl? That would be great. #smile. He didn't know if it was his imagination, but Shin felt Megumi seemed livelier over text than in real life. And so, without anyone else noticing, the two quietly established a connection. Later, they continued chatting online, discussing daily life, family backgrounds, and getting to know each other better. Class time quickly passed, and until the end, Hiratsuka didn't notice that Megumi and Shin had been texting under her nose the whole period. Shin, relying on his key sense, could always stow his phone away just before Hiratsuka glanced over, pretending to pay attention. Megumi, on the other hand, kept her head down, eyes glued to her phone under the desk, but Hiratsuka never noticed her. In some ways, Megumi's low presence had practically reached the level of a superpower. To be continued. Chapter 26, Weekend Plans. So, on Saturday, you'll be with me, then Yukino Shida and Saiyan will be together, after which you'll leave with Yukino Shida, leaving me and Saiyan alone. During lunch, Akagi ate his bento while listening to Shin relay Yukino Shida Yukino's plan to him, nodding along continuously. After hearing Yukino's plan, Akagi had no objections and immediately agreed, seeming quite satisfied with it. However, as he agreed, Akagi gave Shin a look that hinted at something more, with a slight smirk in his tone. But, you and Yukino Shida leaving together, and you still claim there's nothing between you two. We're leaving to give you and Tamiya some alone time, yet here you are, teasing us. Shin looked at Akagi with a hint of exasperation. Did this guy even understand the point of the plan? Would he even muster the courage to win Tamiya over? Shin had already thought that Yukino's plan was a bit shaky, but seeing Akagi's reaction made him even less confident. Just remember, according to what we found out from Yukino Shida, Tamiya doesn't seem to have a particular interest in anyone in the soccer club, so you have to seize this chance. I get it. Once you guys create the opportunity, I'll definitely go for it. Akagi knew this was a chance created by Shin and Yukino for him, so he nodded earnestly. Although he hadn't really gotten to talk to Tamiya Saiyan before, he knew that if he didn't put in the effort now, he might not get another chance. After all, Yukino had accepted a request from Saiyan, and by next week, Saiyan would likely gather the courage to submit an application to join the soccer club as a manager. By then, facing all the guys in the soccer club, Akagi wouldn't have any particular advantage, so he had to establish a solid connection with Saiyan before that happened. Good to hear. Don't waste the effort Yukino Shida and I put into this. Seeing Akagi finally get serious, Shin nodded in satisfaction. Whether or not Yukino's plan was foolproof, at least they'd created a real opportunity for Akagi. But Saturday, that's the day after tomorrow, isn't it? I guess I'd better ask my cousin for help tomorrow to pick out a cool outfit for me. Taking a bite of the drumstick in his bento, Akagi glanced at his phone. Today was Thursday, so the day after tomorrow would be the day they all met up. Akagi was a typical sports guy, and unlike the polished boys in comics, he wasn't great at picking outfits. His fashion sense could best be described as disastrous. So it wasn't surprising that he wanted to ask his family for help, but... Your cousin, you don't mean Akagi Goken, do you? Shin, munching on a bread roll from the school shop, looked at Akagi with mild disbelief. My suggestion is to ask your cousin Haruko instead. Your cousin Goken's advice probably won't be much better than what you'd come up with on your own. Akagi's cousin, Akagi Goken, was the basketball star at another high school, something Akagi had mentioned before. Though Shin hadn't met Goken, he'd seen his story in past manga. Having that gorilla teach Akagi about style. Just imagining it made Shin feel this date was doomed. However, Goken's sister, Haruko Akagi, might give Akagi some good advice. At least she could prevent him from showing up in shorts and a tank top. You're probably right. My cousin doesn't seem all that stylish himself. With Shin's comment, Akagi nodded in agreement. His cousin seemed only good at basketball. When it came to style, he figured it was better to ask a girl. Speaking of which, since I'm asking for help with my outfit, shouldn't you consider it too? But once his plans were sorted, Akagi shifted to consider Shin's appearance. After all, you'll be spending time alone with Yukino Shida, right? I'm only leaving with Yukino Shida to give you and Tamiya some private time. It doesn't mean we'll be spending time together afterward. Shin looked at Akagi, feeling slightly helpless. What was up with this guy? Why did he insist on implying something was going on between him and Yukino Shida? Though they'd quickly exchanged contacts, it was purely for the purpose of helping Akagi with Saiyan, nothing more. Yukino wasn't someone to fall for a person at first sight. Shin was self-aware enough to know that she wouldn't develop feelings just from a brief encounter. Despite Akagi's persistent teasing, Shin wouldn't let a few comments give him any wrong ideas. After we split on Saturday, I've got other plans and won't be with Yukino. What are you doing on Saturday? Akagi looked at Shin curiously, as he generally knew how Shin spent his weekends. Usually, Shin would hole up at home doing 3 things: gaming, and more gaming. If not for the fact that he still socialized well enough at school, Akagi might really have thought he was a total shut-in. Hearing Shin say he had plans outside was quite a surprise. I'm planning to find a martial arts dojo or something to brush up on some techniques. Shin didn't try to hide it, it wasn't exactly a secret. His power level had increased, and his mastery of ki was proficient, but his combat technique was still lacking. While he could unleash a force stronger than his power level in specific areas by channeling ki with skill, it was simply a matter of technique. Even Saiyans, for all their brute strength, had their own fighting style, a system honed through countless battles. Unfortunately, when Shin entered the mission world, he inherited Saiyan abilities but not their combat techniques. In the Dragonball world, Earth was the best place to learn martial arts. Both the Turtle and Demon schools offered solid systems. Too bad he couldn't head to Earth in the Dragonball world anytime soon. Rather than stubbornly waiting to learn only Dragon Ball-style techniques, he decided to pick up skills in the real world instead. Although real-world martial arts wouldn't teach him to fire energy blasts, it was still better than his clumsy brawling. He could still remember when he tried to demonstrate his moves to Bardock and was asked if he had any lingering injuries. Chapter 27, No One Else in the Service Club. Today ended uneventfully, with Hiratsuka Shizuka's usual farewell, and the students in the classroom scattered quickly. Akagi, too, hurriedly said goodbye to a few classmates before rushing off, likely for soccer club practice. Today, Shin didn't do much else besides attending class and chatting with Megumi Kato, chatting face-to-face during breaks and texting during class when he had a moment. To be honest, after a whole day of talking, Shin and Megumi Kato had definitely gotten closer. It was as if Megumi, who seemed like she hadn't found a good conversation partner for a long time, opened up to Shin about all sorts of things, venting her pent-up need for conversation. Perhaps out of understanding Megumi's situation, Shin went along with it and had a great conversation with her. But even though they talked a lot, Megumi still kept that calm expression during face-to-face conversations, and her tone revealed no hint of emotion. It was a long-standing habit of hers, and Shin didn't expect Megumi to suddenly become expressive in just a day. As long as she didn't continue down the path of becoming entirely expressionless, he was fine with it. However, Shin was slightly worried that Megumi seemed to only talk to him now. If this kept up, would she end up only showing emotions in front of him? A beautiful girl who's cold to others but shows her feelings only in front of him. That actually sounds kind of intriguing. After saying goodbye to Megumi and a few other classmates, Shin picked up his bag and left the classroom, ready to head home. Going to the service club yesterday had been a special case. Normally, he was in the go-home club, in other words, he went straight home after school. But just as he reached the school gate, his phone chimed with a notification. Someone had sent him a message. Could it be that Megumi wants to chat again so soon? At the sound of the notification and the vibration in his pocket, Shin's first thought was that Megumi had contacted him again. You couldn't blame him for thinking that. After spending the whole day chatting with Megumi, it was natural that any notification made him subconsciously think it was her. For someone who's often ignored, finding someone who genuinely pays attention to them can bring an outpouring of emotion that's hard to control. Shin stopped, pulled out his phone at the gate, and was ready to reply to Megumi, as he'd done during class today. But upon closer inspection, he realized something was off. It wasn't Megumi who had messaged him, it was someone he hadn't expected at all. Yukino, why didn't you come to the service club today? Huh. Shin was stunned, not expecting a message from Yukino. He hadn't considered the possibility since Yukino usually seemed quite cold and didn't seem like the type to reach out to a guy. But Shin guessed it was likely because Yukino wanted to follow up on the request involving Akagi and Tamiya Saiyan. Didn't we already confirm the plan? Why does she still want me to go to the service club? Feeling confused, Shin replied to Yukino, ignoring her message wasn't an option, since reading the message online would show the red status to the other party. If he left her on read without replying, it'd come across as impolite, and Shin wasn't some clueless young lady using a smartphone for the first time. He naturally wouldn't do something so lacking in social finesse. Still, he couldn't quite understand why Yukino wanted him to come to the service club again. He wasn't even a member, and there was only so much she could rely on him to help out. To refine some of the plan's details, it's easier to discuss it in person. Yukino replied almost immediately, with a well-reasoned answer. After all, Akagi was Shin's friend, so Shin didn't mind putting in some extra effort for him. No one else is in the service club. Perhaps sensing Shin's potential reluctance, Yukino added another line to reassure him. Still, her message came across a bit strange, almost like she was saying, no one else is home, which gave it an oddly ambiguous feel. Though Shin knew Yukino likely didn't mean anything strange by it, it was hard not to read into it a bit. But how did she know I wasn't planning to go to the service club? Putting away his phone, Shin felt a bit intrigued by Yukino's sharp intuition. He had only just reached the school gate, and Yukino had already guessed he wasn't heading to the service club. Thinking this, Shin looked back towards the school building, and with his sharp eyesight, he quickly spotted Yukino's profile in one of the windows, her gaze fixed on the school gate. Realizing she'd been caught, Yukino hurriedly closed the window, her slightly panicked attempt to hide making Shin smile. So she'd noticed him heading towards the gate and quickly messaged him to come to the club. Even someone as cold as Yukino had her cute moments. Since he was only going home to play games, Shin decided to turn around and head back to the school, ready to visit the service club and see what further plans Yukino wanted to discuss. Yukino was a beautiful girl, after all, so discussing things with her wasn't exactly a burden. If Akagi had messaged him at this hour, he'd probably only have replied with a "get lost." Arriving at the service club's door, Shin knocked, and Yukino's cool voice invited him in. He entered to find Yukino waiting, looking every bit as composed as usual, though her ears were slightly red. Probably embarrassed about being caught watching him at the gate. No requests from other students in the service club today. Shin found a chair, looking curiously at Yukino. Yukino calling him here showed her dedication to their accepted request, but it also implied she was relatively free at the moment. If there were other requests to handle, she likely wouldn't have called him over. To be continued. Chapter 28, Are You Going Through a Chibio Phase, 2? The service club doesn't usually get many visitors. After all, not everyone is comfortable sharing their problems with strangers. Yukino calmly brushed her long hair aside as she spoke. Besides, the club president is just a delicate girl. I'm sure there are plenty of people who doubt I can actually help with their problems. That was true enough. Though Yukino was a well-known beauty at school, looks alone don't solve problems. If students had issues, asking family, teachers, or friends was a good choice. Coming to the service club was likely their last resort. Of course, some people sought out the club just to have a chance to talk to Yukino. Akagi was one of those people. But Akagi was pretty straightforward, while others would hesitate. After all, isn't it embarrassing to ask a female classmate for help with something you can't handle yourself? So, in reality, not many people came to the service club. What happened yesterday, with two groups coming in one after the other, was extremely rare. Speaking of which, didn't a girl come to the service club yesterday? Her name was Yotsuya Miko, right? Shin recalled the black-haired girl, Yotsuya Miko, whom he and Akagi had seen leaving the service club when they entered yesterday. It was because of her that Shin began to suspect the existence of malevolent spirits that regular people couldn't see, inspiring him to want to strengthen his own mind and spirit. You know her. Yukino looked at Shin in surprise, as though she hadn't expected him to know even Yotsuya Miko's name. Yotsuya's request, well, how should I put it, was a bit unusual. She asked if I believed in the existence of evil spirits. As expected, Yotsuya Miko had come to the service club hoping someone could help her deal with the spirits she could see. For Yotsuya, she must have tried various methods to get rid of her ability to see spirits but found no solution. Out of sheer desperation, she'd tried coming to the service club to see if it could help. The result was predictable, though. Yukino couldn't see spirits either, so she simply dismissed Yotsuya's question as some kind of chibio, delusional adolescent, behavior. However, looking at it another way, Yotsuya daring to bring up spirits in the club likely meant she sensed no spirits around the service club itself. So you didn't take on her request. Shin was curious about how Yukino Shida had handled Yotsuya's situation. Judging by her mood when she left yesterday, it seemed she didn't receive any help. After all, Yukino Shida didn't seem like someone who could handle issues involving spirits. But Yukino Shida did seem like someone who wanted to help others, so it was unlikely she outright rejected Yotsuya's request, right? I did consider accepting it and was going to suggest she meet with the school counselor. Yukino Shida, with a serious expression, said something that would come across as rude if anyone else said it. If it were just anyone talking, Shin might think they were provoking, but hearing it from Yukino Shida, he could tell she genuinely meant it. But Yotsuya seemed disappointed, turned down the offer, and left right away. There was a hint of confusion in Yukino Shida's voice. She couldn't quite understand why Yotsuya's attitude shifted so suddenly. She had come seeking help, yet suddenly changed her mind and left the service club. Shin could guess, it was likely Yotsuya realized Yukino Shida couldn't help with her problem with spirits, so she left. Still, she came to the service club hoping, just maybe, that there might be someone who could help, so she wouldn't have been entirely disappointed. If Yotsuya comes back to the service club, you can reach out to me. I might be able to help her. Shin nodded to Yukino Shida as he said this. Reach out to you. Yukino Shida looked at Shin with surprise, examining him as if she'd understood something. So, you're also chasing after girls? What are you even thinking? I'm being serious. Shin rolled his eyes at Yukino Shida, who clearly thought he had a thing for Yotsuya. If he admitted it, would Yukino Shida consider it as another request for her club? Do you actually believe in all that stuff about spirits? Seeing that Shin didn't seem to be joking, Yukino Shida looked at him with a hint of skepticism. Who would have thought? Could Shin be a Chibio too? You don't need to worry about that. Either way, you want to help others, right? If I can solve Yotsuya's issue, you introducing her to me would count as helping someone too, wouldn't it? Shin shrugged. If Yotsuya came to him right now, he couldn't do anything to help yet. But tonight, he planned to make a trip into the JoJo universe. With a bit of luck, he should be able to obtain a way to strengthen his spirit and mind. Once he had a stand and a way to fight spirits, he wouldn't need to fear any ghostly threats. But you're not a member of the service club? Yukino Shida furrowed her brow and let out a slight hum, not entirely pleased with Shin's idea. In the end, though, Yukino Shida didn't argue further. If Shin could truly help Yotsuya with her problem, it would be a welcome outcome for Yukino Shida. After all, the reason Yukino Shida founded the service club was to help students solve their problems. Although it might look self-serving at first glance, she genuinely wanted to help others. So even if it was Shin helping rather than herself, Yukino Shida could accept it. Now then, you mentioned calling me over to finalize the details of the plan. Did you have any ideas? After discussing the issues surrounding the service club and Yotsuya, Shin hadn't forgotten the main reason Yukino Shida had called him here. Of course. With Shin bringing the topic back on track, Yukino Shida nodded and continued. You've told Akagi about my plan by now, haven't you? Shin nodded. Since he didn't have much of a plan himself, he decided to go along with Yukino Shida's. But there may be some unexpected factors. Seeing Shin's response, Yukino Shida continued. After we leave, there's a chance that Akagi and Tamiya might not continue working together and could go their separate ways. Shin had considered this too. He had thought Yukino Shida might not have foreseen it, but it seemed she had. He nodded, looking at Yukino Shida. So, what's your plan? Chapter 29, 2 Days with Yukino Shida. Tamiya doesn't know Akagi is planning to pursue her, but Akagi is fully aware of the plan. Yukino Shida—Yukino's expression radiated confidence, just like when she first decided on this plan. If that's the case, we just need to stay in close contact with Akagi, monitor his interactions with Tamiya, and provide real-time advice when necessary. Real-time advice. So, you're planning to follow Akagi and Tamiya around. Shin could see what Yukino Shida was getting at. To prevent Akagi from panicking at a critical moment, Yukino Shida decided to guide him remotely to ensure he stayed with Tamiya. After all, Akagi had confessed he'd be too shy to approach Tamiya Cheyenne when it came down to it. If on Saturday, after Shin and Yukino Shida left, Akagi didn't dare talk to Tamiya, they might just part ways, each heading home alone. Yukino Shida had thought of this possibility and decided to monitor Akagi's actions, providing guidance at crucial times to keep them together. However, monitoring Akagi and Tamiya in real time wasn't easy. The only method was to trail them, essentially, follow them closely. Pretty much. Although it's not ideal, Akagi and Tamiya aren't the type to approach each other, so we have to help them along, Yukino Shida replied, unfazed by this approach. Akagi is too shy to talk to girls, and Tamiya is an innocent girl oblivious to romance. Left to their own devices, they'd probably never make any progress. So, tailing them while giving real-time advice. Shin mused, feeling a bit torn. He'd planned to check out a martial arts dojo this Saturday to pick up some techniques. But if he agreed to Yukino Shida's plan, he'd have no time for the dojo, as they'd be shadowing Akagi and Tamiya's date all day. Having Yukino Shida's company wouldn't be unpleasant, but it would cost him a day, leaving Shin slightly hesitant. What's wrong? Do you have other plans for Saturday? Yukino Shida noticed his hesitation and asked. She wasn't the type to pressure others. If Shin had other plans, she would adjust. Though she'd never dated, Yukino Shida had a certain mysterious confidence that she could come up with an alternative plan. Sort of. I was planning to check out a dojo after parting ways with you guys on Saturday, Shin admitted. Finding a place to learn some martial arts wasn't embarrassing, it was good for health, after all. Not that health was his main concern. Physically, he was probably unmatched. He'd never heard of anyone in this world with the strength of, say, Hanma Baki. His main goal at the dojo was to gain combat techniques, not that they'd compare to Dragon Ball style techniques, but it'd be better than just flashy moves. A dojo, huh? I see, Yukino Shida nodded thoughtfully before quickly responding. How about this? In return for helping you, I can take you to a dojo run by a famous kendo instructor I know. It's not a dojo exactly, but it should do, right? A kendo dojo. Shin was surprised, then fell into thought. Many in Dragon Ball use weapons, though weapons aren't the main focus. The power of ki in Dragon Ball far surpasses that of weapons. Even Trunks, who once used a sword, rarely uses it later on. But creating weapons out of ki is another path. In Dragon Ball, there are examples of using ki as weapons. For example, Zamasu in Dragon Ball Super, who used a giant energy scythe after becoming Goku Black. Krillin's Destructo Disc, though a projectile, has shown to take down enemies beyond his level. If Shin could shape ki into a weapon like a sword, kendo techniques might be a good fit. Imagining himself wielding a blade with the same destructive power as the Destructo Disc in battle, he figured it'd be more potent than simple energy blasts. Rest assured, the kendo dojo I know is very reputable. So, what do you think? Yukino Shida asked, with a slight smile. He trusted the quality of Yukino Shida's recommendation. Her family had some influence, so her kendo contacts would likely be skilled. All right, I'll go with you on Saturday, he agreed after some thought. Instead of randomly picking a dojo, he'd let Yukino Shida lead him to a top-tier kendo dojo. Great. Then we're all set for Sunday, Yukino Shida replied, looking pleased. Huh? You're coming too? Shin was surprised. He'd thought Yukino Shida would merely refer him to the dojo. But from what she said, it sounded like she planned to accompany him. Of course. I wouldn't want any miscommunication between you and the dojo, so I'll be there to oversee things, Yukino Shida said, her perfectionism showing. Still, Shin couldn't help scratching his head. His weekend seemed to be fully claimed by Yukino Shida. To be continued. Chapter 30, The Gaming Shut-in on the Other Side of the Screen. After leaving the service club, Shin returned home, dropped his bag by the bed, and sat at his desk, turning on his computer. Homework could wait, gaming came first. Shin was currently into an online RPG, a standard Japanese RPG with a slow pace. Shin wasn't picky, though. The moment he logged in, a private message popped up. Rescue Angel, hey, Zuke. Are you up for a raid this Saturday? It's the new high difficulty one. Yes, Shin's in-game name was Zuke, which he also used as his username when he entered Infinite Horror VR. Usernames are like habits. Once you get used to one, you tend to reuse it across platforms. So, if you ever see Zuke around, it might just be Shin. Zuke, got plans this Saturday, can't make it. Shin quickly messaged back to Rescue Angel that he was busy Saturday. Since he'd promised Yukino Shida, he'd keep his word, though he'd rather be gaming. Rescue Angel, what? You, busy on a Saturday? A miracle. Not a date, is it? Rescue Angel was even more of a shut-in than Shin. While he mostly stayed home on weekends, this player was online nearly 24/7. Supposedly a girl, though Shin wasn't sure, anyone online could claim to be anything. Zuke, not a date, but I might spend the whole day watching others date. He sighed. He and Yukino Shida, two singles, spending the weekend helping a couple, just felt odd. Rescue Angel, that sounds like a weird hobby. Can you do Sunday instead? Apparently content with Shin's vague explanation, Rescue Angel moved on to suggesting Sunday. It was true that Shin typically gamed all weekend, so Sunday seemed open. Unfortunately, just yesterday that would have worked. Now, thanks to the service club, Yukino Shida had also booked his Sunday. Zuke, I'm busy Sunday too. Rescue Angel, what? Are you turning into a normie? Clearly, Rescue Angel had assumed they were cut from the same shut-in cloth. Zuke, it's just some personal stuff. Not everyone is online 24/7 like you, you know. Rescue Angel, how rude. I do leave the house for school. Zuke, you're still in school. Shin was surprised to learn this. He'd assumed she spent all day gaming. Apparently, she might just be a chronic late arrival and early leaver. Rescue Angel, as long as it's not a date. All the decent players I know drop out as soon as they get a girlfriend. Rescue Angel wasn't worried about his situation out of any special feelings, purely for his gaming skills. Zuke, true, but still, that sounds harsh. Rescue Angel, I'm just saying, if you ever really want a date, I might help you out. Zuke, pretty confident in calling yourself cute, huh? For all the raids they'd done together, this was the most he'd heard her talk. Rescue Angel, I'm not exaggerating. Back home, I was called a once-in-a-lifetime beauty. Zuke, what, are the people there all ancient spirits? Zuke didn't take it seriously. Online, anyone can claim anything. Zuke, anyway, I'm busy this weekend. Let's raid next week. Rescue Angel, fine. If you're out, I can't find enough teammates anyway. Good time to go to my job, I guess. Zuke, you have a job. Rescue Angel, my allowance is tight, it barely covers my gaming expenses, so I got a part-time job, though I haven't gone in ages. Zuke, the fact you still have the job is a miracle. That boss must be a saint. From this conversation, Shin could practically picture this player's lifestyle, late to school, obsessed with online games, being absent from work. No, the more I think about it, the more I feel that this girl is a useless person. To be continued. Chapter 31, First Look into the JoJo World. After playing some games and taking a bit of time to finish his homework, Shin finally went to wash up, put on his pajamas, and lay down in bed. Today had been pretty fulfilling. At school, he developed a close chatting relationship with Megumi Kato and scheduled weekend plans with Yukino Shida. Spending time with beautiful girls really does lift one's spirits. Both Megumi and Yukino are delightful to look at. If it were with some burly guys instead, Shin likely wouldn't consider it a fulfilling day. Shin closed his eyes, calmed his mind, and maintained steady breathing, quickly drifting into sleep. But for him, sleep was not the end of the day, it was the beginning of another world. Honorable Zuke, please choose a mission world to enter. 1. Dragonball. 2. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. The system's world selection prompt popped up again, but this time, Shin could enter the JoJo world for exploration. In the Dragon Ball world, his spherical spaceship was still on its long journey to Planet Zuno. According to the estimated arrival time, it would take another 6 days to reach its destination. So, for the next 6 days, he'd be busy in the JoJo world, hopefully acquiring the stand ability he wanted. The method to gain a stand was simple, just get pierced by one of those arrows that can activate a stand. However, getting an arrow would be tricky. These special arrows were initially monopolized by only a few individuals, so getting one would depend on the circumstances. Enter JoJo's Bizarre Adventure world. This time, there was no warning about insufficient entry attempts. Shin felt his body plummeting through a void before a flash of light appeared, and he found himself in a different world. Transitioning to Zuke. As his surroundings brightened, a wave of heat hit him instantly, causing beads of sweat to form on his forehead. Is this a desert? Could I have been sent straight to Egypt? Looking around quickly, he noticed that he was indeed surrounded by yellow sand, a desert landscape. It was no wonder he felt so hot. Upon closer inspection, there was a town in the distance, and he only had to walk a bit to get there. Thankfully, he hadn't been dropped right in the middle of the desert. He recalled that the main storyline of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 3 culminates in Egypt. Could he have been lucky enough to land in the Part 3 timeline? Before heading to the desert town, Zuke first stretched and assessed his physical condition. As with entering the Dragon Ball world, his appearance and body were almost unchanged. A powerful energy surged within him, and his 40 combat points from the real world had also followed him here. So, every time I enter a new world, my abilities from the real world sync up with it. Zuke understood the synchronization process. The 40 combat points from his real-world body were carried over to the JoJo world. If that's the case, then any strength he gains in JoJo might carry over to Dragon Ball next time too. At first, he felt disadvantaged by the lack of spiritual and mental defenses among Dragon Ball characters, but now it seemed it might actually work to his advantage. To defeat Frieza, he previously thought increasing his combat power was his only option. But now, he might also consider spiritual and mental attack methods. Of course, this would depend on him acquiring techniques for such attacks. Stands are manifestations of mental power, but their attack methods don't always target the mind or soul. Hey there, young man, traveling alone. Need a guide? As soon as he entered the town, a burly localman started bothering Zuke. Probably due to Zuke's relatively slender build, lack of luggage, and absence of companions, the men decided to approach him. Technically, Zuke wouldn't understand Egyptian, but since this is an anime world, he naturally understood what the local was saying. No, thank you. Zuke simply waved him off, uninterested in dealing with this man. He wasn't here to sightsee, he was here to find Dio. First, he needed to determine where this town was located and the current date and time. Although it's Egypt, his primary target, Dio, should be in Cairo. If this town wasn't Cairo, he wouldn't waste time here. Hey, young man, traveling alone in Egypt without a guide can lead to trouble with street thugs. Just a few steps in, Zuke felt the man place a hand on his shoulder. Though Zuke could easily shrug off the man's grip if he wanted, he decided to stop and look at the man. The previously friendly-looking man now had a hint of menace in his eyes, and several other men behind him were eyeing Zuke with strange smiles. By this point, it was obvious that this wasn't a genuine guide but a thug looking to extort a tourist. However, upon realizing this, Zuke's eyes lit up. The reason was simple: since gaining these 40 combat points from Dragon Ball, he hadn't had a chance to use them. In the real world, he led an ordinary life, didn't attract bullies, and hardly encountered street thugs. His fists had been itching for 2 days. In fact, even the idea of visiting a martial arts school was partly motivated by the urge to release some pent-up energy. Now, in the JoJo world, he finally had some thugs to test his strength on. Zuke's gaze toward the men became enthusiastic. Smiling, he peeled the man's hand off his shoulder and replied with a bright smile. All right, let's find a quiet spot to discuss your guide fee, shall we? Ah, sure. The man, surprised by how easily Zuke had removed his hand, hesitated but, tempted by the lure of money, ignored this detail. He'd done this many times before, and although Zuke's expression seemed a bit off, his response was similar to that of other tourists who had caved in. So, without much thought, he and his accomplices led Zuke toward a nearby alleyway. To be continued. Chapter 32, Ransacking a Thug's Wealth is a Traditional Skill. With a swift kick to the local thug's stomach, he was sent flying, crashing into the wall and slowly sliding down. Ugh. The thug curled up on the ground, clutching his stomach. He retched the moment he opened his mouth. Even though Zuke had held back his strength, it was still too much for an average person to endure. How disgusting. Don't let your vomit splatter on me. If any gets on my shoes, you'll be licking the floor clean. Zuke glanced disdainfully at the thug, whose eyes were nearly popping out of his head, then looked at the other unconscious gang members sprawled around him, shaking his foot a little. After all, these were just regular people. Zuke had questions to ask, so killing them outright wasn't an option. Since he'd already killed Elec, Zuke no longer felt any psychological discomfort with killing. However, he also knew he had to learn to control his strength. These thugs were the perfect test to figure out what level of force could bring intense pain to a normal person without killing them. That way, if he ever found himself in a similar situation in the real world, he'd know just how much force to use. I was wrong, please spare me. I won't do anything like this ever again. The thug, now terrified, didn't care about the searing pain in his stomach. He quickly kowtowed in apology, fearing that Zuke's next kick would land on his head. A footprint was clearly visible on the wall beside him, a mark of the kick Zuke had just unleashed. The thug was well aware his skull was not as hard as that stone wall. If Zuke hadn't held back, that wall would have been smashed, much like how Bacterian in Dragon Ball smashed a wall with his elbow. Who is Bacterian, you ask? He's the henchman that little Goku defeated in 3 strikes during the 22nd World Martial Arts Tournament. Zuke's combat power is a bit higher than his now. Hand over all the money you have. Zuke commanded the thug to empty his pockets. He had no currency for this world, so it was as good a time as any to collect some. If they weren't in Cairo, then the money these thugs had on them could at least cover his travel expenses. Hearing Zuke's words, the thug quickly nodded and hurriedly went around to collect all the money from his companions. He didn't dare try to escape. Zuke's speed was clear to him. Just a moment ago, Zuke had closed the distance and delivered the kick in the blink of an eye. There was no way he could outrun him. It's all here. After gathering his comrades' money, the thug also handed over his own wallet, hoping Zuke would let them go once he'd taken it. Zuke pocketed the cash without a second thought, then continued questioning him. What year is it now? What month and day? How far is it to Cairo? Ordinarily, these questions would seem absurd. No one, even if they didn't keep track of the date, would forget what year it was. Even if he had been locked up for years, he wouldn't be this out of touch. However, the thug was in no position to argue. The excruciating stomach pain made him suspect he'd suffered serious internal damage, and he only wanted Zuke to leave so he could get to a hospital. It's 1987. December 26th. Having just passed Christmas, the thug was able to recall the date even in his pain-addled state. December 26th, 1987. Excellent. Zuke nodded in satisfaction. He couldn't remember the exact timing of JoJo's 3rd arc, but he knew Dio's death was slated for January. So, he had entered JoJo's 3rd arc just in time, with a month left before Dio's demise. Since his main quest required him to kill Dio, Zuke wouldn't let the Joestar group handle it. He had to strike before them. While he could consider teaming up with the Joestar group to take down Dio, waiting for that moment seemed too time-consuming. Moreover, at this point, the arrow needed for a stand awakening should be in Dio's possession. Without a stand, dealing with Dio would be risky. Even though his combat power far exceeded human limits, Dio's stand, the world, had the ability to stop time. If time was stopped, no matter how strong Zuke was, he'd be at a severe disadvantage. If Zuke had a power level of over 100, he might be confident enough to crush Dio's head before he could activate his time stop. But unfortunately, his combat power was only around 40, while shattering walls was easy. He couldn't prevent Dio from reacting. Besides, he'd have to get close to Dio, or Dio would likely pummel him from a distance with the world. The world's destructive power was rated as an A, placing it among the strongest stands, second only to exceptions like Star Platinum, which also could break walls with a single punch. In other words, Zuke didn't have much of a power advantage when dealing with the world. I still need to acquire a stand. After considering his options, Zuke realized that acquiring a stand was essential to defeating Dio. With a powerful enough stand ability, combined with his own strength, he could easily bring Dio to his knees. Well, maybe. We're not done yet. How far are we from Cairo? Although Zuke had been thinking intensely, only a moment had passed. He kicked the thug again, pressing him for an answer. This is Cairo, just the outskirts. The thug dared not lie, answering quickly to avoid another beating. If you want to go into the city center, just take a bus. I see. Got it. You may go. Zuke looked at the battered thug and nodded, finally letting him go. This meant he wasn't far from Dio's mansion and, by extension, from the arrow. In JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, 6 arrows were explicitly mentioned. Diavolo had unearthed them and sold 5 at a high price to an old woman named Enya. This Enya happened to be one of Dio's followers. In the original, Yoshihiro Kira once bought an arrow from Enya in Egypt, mistaking it for a decorative piece, which means Enya might currently be in Cairo's antique market. With this thought in mind, Zuke exited the alley and, following the thug's directions, found the bus to downtown Cairo. He boarded, planning his next steps. First, I'll head to the Cairo market and see if I can locate Enya. If I can buy an arrow before Kira does, everything will fall into place. To be continued. Chapter 33, The Arrow That Awakens a Stand. Taking a bus, Zuke arrived in downtown Cairo and successfully located the largest market there. In 1980s Egypt, nearly all stereotypical images of the country were present: Egyptians dressed in traditional garb, rugged stone buildings, and bustling markets filled with ancient artifacts. Zuke even saw a stall selling a few skulls, who knows from which pyramid they'd been unearthed. If this were the Yu-Gi-Oh! Set, Zuke might have been scouring the area for an Egyptian carrying a Millennium item, perhaps even tricking one into giving him such a treasure. But this was the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure set, where Millennium items were out of the question, and his target was an old lady with 2 right hands. The market was quite extensive, so Zuke took his time wandering leisurely, observing each vendor with care. In the original storyline, Enya made her move after the protagonist's group defeated 7 enemies, leaving Egypt for Pakistan to ambush them. However, based on the date Zuke heard from the burly men earlier, it seemed the protagonist's group had not yet reached that point, so Enya should still be in Cairo. This old lady, Enya, held 5 arrows purchased from Diavolo, and she was a trusted ally of Dio, providing him with funds, shelter, and helping him create stand-wielding followers. Some of the funds Enya provided for Dio might even have been raised by selling these arrows, which would explain why she once sold one as a mere craft item to Yoshihiro Kira. Finding Enya would greatly aid Zuke's main quest. He might even complete half of it in just one day. Since this was the Cairo city center, Zuke wandered the market for some time without encountering the kind of thugs who had previously tried to extort him. Though many merchants still tried to overcharge, Zuke didn't intend to buy anything here, so he simply ignored them. His efforts eventually bore fruit. After more than an hour of wandering, he finally spotted a nondescript stall in a corner of the market. The stall appeared rather old, displaying various ornaments of unique shapes, and behind it stood a short, elderly woman with white hair and a face full of wrinkles. Most notably, her 2 hands faced the same way. She had 2 right hands. Hee, is there something that catches your eye, dear customer? Noticing Zuke's gaze, Enya let out a slightly eerie chuckle, inviting him to take a closer look. Zuke squinted, refraining from walking over immediately. Instead, he used his ability to sense ki to scan the people around Enya's stall. As a stand user herself, Enya's stand, Justice, was composed of fog and could manipulate corpses by injecting them with mist through wounds. In the original story, Enya brutally killed an entire small town's residents in Pakistan, controlling their corpses to act as if they were still alive, an extremely ruthless act. However, sensing through ki, Zuke detected that all those around Enya's stall were living humans, not corpses, indicating they hadn't fallen victim to her. Reassured, Zuke approached the stall, pretending to browse its wares while secretly searching for the arrows. The items on display were mainly ornaments, and compared to other stalls, these were notably more beautiful. No wonder Yoshihiro Kira mistook the arrow he bought from Enya as a mere trinket at first. It had likely been displayed alongside these ornaments. After a thorough search, though, Zuke's heart began to sink. Though the ornaments covered a range of styles, none of them were arrows. With Enya's departure for Pakistan not far off, the arrow she planned to sell might have already been purchased by Yoshihiro Kira. In fact, Zuke had always felt that the arrow in Yoshihiro Kira's possession would be the easiest to acquire. Initially, Yoshihiro Kira regarded it as nothing more than a decorative piece, unaware of its powers until he and his son were accidentally pricked by it, leading them to discover its significance. That realization would only come much later. For now, Yoshihiro Kira remained an ordinary person who possessed the arrow but knew nothing of its use. If Zuke wanted, he could travel to Morio in Japan, guard the Kira household, and rely on his own combat prowess to seize the arrow from Yoshihiro Kira before he awakened his stand. The problem, however, was that Zuke didn't know when Yoshihiro Kira would leave Egypt and return to Japan. If Kira returned too late, Dio would have already been defeated by the protagonists, and possessing the arrow would be meaningless. Even with a stand awakened, the inability to complete the main quest of defeating Dio would leave Zuke's sync rate permanently at 0%, barring him from returning to the real world. Though these thoughts weighed on him, Zuke kept his expression neutral, concealing his intentions from Enya. "Is this all the merchandise you have, ma'am? Any other items?" he asked. "Oh. This customer seems to have a discerning eye." Enya didn't suspect Zuke's interest in the arrow. After all, she saw many Asian tourists here every day. Compared to other customers, Zuke merely stood out by traveling alone. "If you're interested, I do have a rather unique item here," she said, smiling as she slowly crouched down and retrieved a long, narrow box from beneath the stall. Seeing the box, Zuke's heart skipped a beat. Could it be the item he was looking for? "This is the arrow, a very precious item, but I already have several in my possession, so I'm willing to sell one to raise some funds." Enya opened the long box, revealing an arrow with a meteorite-crafted head and a wooden shaft clearly added later. Though not the special, beetle arrow, this was indeed an arrow capable of awakening a stand. Zuke's heart raced, relieved that he'd asked for additional items instead of leaving. It seemed Yoshihiro Kira hadn't purchased the arrow yet. Perhaps he, like Zuke, had asked an extra question, prompting Enya to bring it out. To be continued. Chapter 34, Still Not Enough Power. "Oh. This arrow's pretty nice. How much is it?" Zuke pretended to be seeing the arrow for the first time, casually reaching into the box to pick it up and examine it in his hand. He casually asked about the price, even though he knew it wouldn't be cheap. Enya would definitely name a price several times higher than her cost, aiming for a profit. Zuke only had the money he took from some local thugs, even after spending a bit on bus fare, so he knew it wouldn't be enough. "This arrow isn't cheap at all. It cost me quite a bit when I acquired it." Enya smiled as she watched him hold the arrow but made no move to stop him, simply slipping into the usual bargaining tone of merchants everywhere. To be fair, she wasn't lying. She'd spent quite a lot buying 5 arrows from Diavolo. "How much, exactly?" "Well, put it this way, with the initial funding Enya gave him, Diavolo built the Passion organization, which became powerful enough to influence politics, business, and the underworld alike. Of course, this rise was due in part to Diavolo's methods, but a huge amount of startup capital was essential, too." Zuke was fully prepared to hear an astronomical price. But what concerned him more was how Enya didn't seem bothered by him holding the arrow in his hands. Keep in mind, Enya was a short, elderly woman. If Zuke decided to run off with it, she wouldn't be able to catch him. Yet she showed no concern at all, implying she was certain she could stop him before he escaped. A stand. Enya's mislike stand, justice, must be her confidence. Zuke knew exactly what Enya's confidence came from. In truth, he had no reliable way of dealing with her stand. His fighting power of 40 was strong enough to crush most people in terms of strength and speed, but her missed stand, justice, happened to be immune to physical damage. If Zuke's power were higher, he could blast it with a strong enough ki wave to evaporate it altogether. But with his current strength, he couldn't create such a wave. If he learned the Kamehameha, it might be possible. The Kamehameha is one of the most powerful ki waves, but unfortunately, he couldn't learn it for now. Why, one of the most powerful? There's actually another, even stronger ki wave, the Tri-beam, though it's dangerous to the user's life. As for instant transmission, his 1% synchronization rate isn't enough for him to teleport out of the market. From the original story, Enya's stand, justice, could cover an entire town, making it difficult for Zuke to escape her range. "This amount, and the arrow is yours." Sure enough, under Zuke's gaze, Enya named an exaggeratedly high price, making his eyelid twitch. The exact figure? Suffice it to say, it was a sum ordinary people couldn't afford. After hearing it, Zuke's heart raced as he remembered that old man Yoshihiro Kira. How could he afford such a high price for a craft item? But then he remembered Yoshihiro Kira's introduction in the original story, where he mentioned his family descended from samurai, meaning they likely had a decent inheritance. Still, spending so much on a craft item was absurd. Could Enya have given Yoshihiro a much lower price than she offered Zuke? "It's too expensive, I didn't bring that much cash." Zuke calmly put the arrow back in the box, pretending to be deeply interested, and said to Enya, "But I am genuinely interested in this craft item." Could you hold it for me? I'll bring the money by tomorrow at the latest. This was mainly to prevent Yoshihiro Kira from showing up and taking an interest in the arrow, as he did in the original story, where he ultimately bought it. So Zuke hoped Enya would keep it aside for him and not sell it to someone else. Hee, I can tell you really like this arrow. Very well, I'll hold it for you. I won't sell it to anyone else until this time tomorrow. Enya saw the genuine interest in Zuke's eyes and didn't suspect any other motives. She simply smiled kindly and nodded in agreement. If someone didn't know her true nature, they might think she was just a kindly old woman. But Zuke knew very well, this woman wouldn't blink while killing. As I said, this arrow has a unique power, it chooses specific people. I can sense it, this arrow is as interested in you as you are in it. Watching Zuke put the arrow back in the box, Enya's voice carried a strange, eerie chuckle, like a mystic seer. If you can't gather the money by tomorrow, you can come see me. There might be other ways to replace payment. The arrow truly did choose people, and this arrow was likely the one Yoshihiro Kira possessed in Part 4 of the original story. In Part 4, the arrow chose people with potential and even awakened new abilities in stand users when needed. The final boss of Part 4, Yoshihiro Kira, used this arrow to awaken new powers in his stand. Though the arrow lay motionless in the box, Enya seemed to see something and gave Zuke a chilling smile. Zuke knew her other methods probably involved swearing allegiance to Dio and aiding him against the Part 3 protagonists. If merely pretending to be loyal would get him the arrow, he didn't mind. But Dio had ways of controlling his followers. As a vampire, Dio could implant a special flesh bud to control his followers' thoughts and actions. Even after his death, these buds would turn people into mindless, undead monsters. If Zuke pretended to be loyal, Dio would probably plant one of these buds in him, which he absolutely couldn't accept. It would be better to be controlled by Babidi, at least, in that case, you could resist with willpower. So the best option was to gather enough funds to buy the arrow directly from Enya. Would Enya back out? From the fact that Yoshihiro Kira had it in Part 4, Zuke was confident she would sell it, so he wasn't worried. If I could synchronize more fighting power from the Dragon Ball world, I wouldn't need to play these games. Leaving the market, Zuke sighed. All this scheming was necessary because he lacked strength. To be continued. Chapter 35, the episode most reminiscent of the beautiful country. After leaving the market, Zuke first made sure to distance himself from where Enya was, taking care not to be spotted by her stand-in before he began gathering funds. Gathering funds, in Zuke's case, was similar to how many newly empowered protagonists go about it, starting with a bit of rob the robbers. This is all the money I have. In a dimly lit alley, a strangely dressed thug knelt on the ground, trembling as he handed over all the valuables he had to Zuke. Judging by the bruises covering his body, it was obvious he had received some rough treatment prior to this. Zuke collected the money but didn't immediately let the thug go. Instead, he asked the question he had already asked a few other lowlifes, do you know any places nearby where I could make some fast money? Places to make fast money? I don't know, the thug stammered, shaking his head in ignorance. If he knew where to make fast money, he wouldn't need to live like a petty thug. What I mean is, are there any places around here where people bet on underground fights or anything of that sort? You're a thug, you should know something, right? Zuke pressed further, clearly frustrated by his financial desperation. The money he had gotten so far from these thugs was negligible. There's really nothing, or maybe there is, but I just don't know. The thug was on the verge of tears. Zuke wasn't particularly imposing in size, but the sight of him kicking a hole in the stone wall left a lasting psychological scar on him. He was terrified that if he didn't satisfy Zuke, he'd end up with a hole in his own body. Well, what about Cairo's underground gangs? You should know how to contact them, right? This wasn't the first time Zuke had heard this answer, so he wasn't too disappointed, he just kept asking questions. Underground fighting was undoubtedly a fast way to make money, but if he couldn't locate a fighting venue, then maybe he could find one of those wealthy gangsters and pull off a heist. I really don't know. Useless. Zuke was so annoyed with these clueless thugs that he laughed. He kicked the guy in the head, making his eyes roll back as he fell unconscious on the ground. Zuke felt a sense of frustration. This place wasn't the decadent land of the beautiful country. Back there, even before his mutation, Spider-Man had been just a nerdy student, yet as soon as he transformed, he knew exactly where to find underground fight clubs to make money. Why didn't it work the same way for him? He initially thought that these small-time thugs might be able to provide him with some information about Cairo's underground world. If he could rob Egypt's gangs, it wouldn't be a problem. But most of these thugs were just ordinary people with bad attitudes, far removed from actual criminal underworld dealings. After spending over an hour finding a handful of small-time criminals, he only collected a paltry amount, nowhere near what he needed to buy that arrow. At this rate, even if he spent his entire 8-hour window doing this, he wouldn't even earn 1% of the funds he needed. He had to think of a new plan. Zuke had already thought of 2 alternative strategies. The first was to head to Cairo's city center and rob a wealthy individual. While he didn't want to do anything too immoral, he didn't have any qualms about targeting a capitalist. After all, these wealthy types were rolling in cash, and taking some wouldn't harm them much. Besides, the amount needed for that arrow was something even the Kira family could afford. The problem was that Dio's mansion was also located in Cairo's city center, where many of Dio's followers gathered. If Zuke drew too much attention, he might end up on Dio's radar sooner than expected. He wasn't afraid of ordinary stand users, but Dio had a particularly powerful spatial stand among his followers that Zuke would need to guard against. The last thing he wanted was to end up like 0.5 Gojo. The second plan was to reach out to one of the protagonists from Part 3, specifically Joseph Joestar, the protagonist of Part 2. By this point in time, 1987, Joseph Joestar had amassed considerable wealth in the US and was destined to become a renowned real estate tycoon, backed by the influential SPW Foundation. If Zuke explained the situation to him, Joseph would undoubtedly send him money without hesitation to help him acquire the arrow from Dio's minions. The issue with this plan was that Zuke had no way of contacting Joseph Joestar. In 1987, there were no smartphones. Most people still relied on landlines or payphones for communication. Cell phones from that era were infamous for their size, even earning the nickname Big Brother. Zuke was sure Joseph Joestar, that rich guy, owned one, but he'd need Joseph's number to contact him. As a last resort, Zuke had one final option. If he couldn't gather enough money, he could try handling the arrow under the guise of admiring the artifact and, accidentally, prick his finger on it. After all, the arrow was a genuine weapon, so accidentally getting pricked while handling it wouldn't seem suspicious, right? In Part 6 of JoJo, the protagonist Jolin Kujo also awakened her stand after being pricked by a fragment of the arrow, proving that a minor injury was sufficient for stand awakening. However, Zuke viewed this as the worst option. He wanted to secure the arrow, not leave it in Enya's possession. Moreover, if he pricked his finger in Enya's presence, she would realize he might awaken a stand and would likely prevent him from leaving. More importantly, Enya's stand, Justice, allowed her to control others by injecting her mist into their wounds. If he injured his finger in front of her, that wound could become her entry point. This was why Zuke refrained from choosing this route earlier when he was handling the arrow. The main issue was that he didn't have much time in this world, only 8 hours each day. Many approaches that required prolonged engagement were simply impossible under these time constraints. Without these restrictions, Zuke could have had plenty of money-making opportunities. He could have even taken the time to become a world champion, going down a path similar to Mr. Satan's. To be continued. Chapter 36, Yoshihiro Kira comes knocking. After entering the JoJo world for over 2 hours, Zuke was crouching by a busy street in central Cairo, observing the bustling crowds. As a major city in Egypt, downtown Cairo felt more like a modern city, far better than the market and outskirts he'd passed earlier. Here, Zuke also spotted a fair number of rich locals, impeccably dressed, driving through the streets in sleek cars, and he couldn't help but feel the urge to act. If he could just swipe some cash from one of these big shots, he'd have enough to buy the arrow from Enya right away. However, Zuke restrained himself for now. They had to be near Dio's mansion, and acting recklessly might draw the attention of Dio's men. While Zuke waited on the street corner, many young women and well-off ladies tried striking up conversations with him. Zuke's good looks stood out, especially since handsome Asian faces were rare in Cairo, so these women seemed eager for a taste of the exotic. Some even hinted at offering considerable sums, which made Zuke marvel at how many wealthy people there were in this city center. But he politely declined all their advances, even when they raised their offers. For one, their heavy makeup wasn't his style, and for another, he worried he'd burn through his remaining 6 hours in this world if he overdid it. Ahem, no other reason. Standing here isn't getting me anywhere. Maybe I should try tailing one of these wealthy folks and act when no one's around. After some time observing Cairo's streets, Zuke began to get a feel for the movements of the affluent. He wasn't loitering aimlessly but rather scoping out the area. From about half an hour of watching, he noticed that most wealthy Cairo residents traveled by private car, typically with a chauffeur. It was almost impossible to lure one of these folks somewhere secluded since they all traveled along main roads, never venturing down alleys. However, Zuke noticed a clothing store across the street, apparently one catering to the wealthy. Several private cars had already parked outside, with well-fed patrons waddling inside, only to emerge shortly afterward and leave by car. This was Zuke's chance. He could wait for a car to stop, knock out the driver, and then, once the rich client returned, drive them to a secluded location. Most of these people sat in the back seat, so with a bit of caution, they wouldn't even notice the driver had changed. Once Zuke had driven them somewhere isolated, he could rob them without worrying about Dio's henchmen noticing. Oh, and could Zuke drive? Not a problem, he had a driver's license back in his world before he began jumping into the multiverse. Though it had been 2.5 years since he last drove, muscle memory should kick in, probably. At worst, if he ended up crashing, he could just protect himself with Ki. Even a head-on collision with a truck wouldn't leave a scratch. With his mind made up, Zuke leaned casually against a lamppost across from the store, eyes fixed on the entrance, waiting for the next wealthy victim to appear. About 10 minutes later, a taxi stopped in front of the store. Zuke was surprised but didn't pay it much mind. The store clearly offered services for the rich but also had some options affordable to the general public, so it wasn't unusual for regular people to come and go. But Zuke's target wasn't an average person. Not only did robbing them feel wrong, but their pockets probably wouldn't satisfy his needs. After all, no ordinary person would carry their entire fortune around. Zuke dismissed the taxi, thinking it was probably just a regular civilian. But when he saw who stepped out, his eyes widened in shock. The man who exited the cab had graying hair, a frail figure, and was obviously advanced in years. Zuke recognized him, or rather, knew of him. It was Yoshihiro Kira's father, Yoshihiro Kira. If Zuke hadn't interfered, this man would have bought the arrow from Enya, taken it back to Japan's Morio town, and unleashed havoc in the fourth part of the story. Of course, Zuke thought, Enya is due to leave Cairo for Pakistan soon, so Yoshihiro Kira would naturally be here if he plans to buy the arrow from her. Zuke's heart raced. If robbing an unknown wealthy stranger posed some risks, robbing Yoshihiro Kira was a golden opportunity. Other rich people might have bodyguards or guns on them, which could attract unwanted attention. But Yoshihiro was a Japanese traveler and unlikely to be carrying a gun, so Zuke didn't have to worry about drawing attention. More importantly, if Yoshihiro was here to buy the arrow, he'd definitely be carrying enough cash. Perfect, this couldn't be easier. As Yoshihiro Kira entered the store, Zuke strode toward it as well, ready to make his move. Would he feel guilty robbing Yoshihiro Kira? Absolutely not. This man would do anything to protect his murderous son, a monster who'd go on to use the arrow to conceal his crimes from the police. By robbing him, Zuke would prevent him from buying the arrow, potentially stopping Yoshihiro Kira from ever awakening his stand powers. It might even mean Yoshihiro would be caught by the police sooner, a true service to society. To be continued. Chapter 37, Purity not yet comparable to holding a diamond. Entering the clothing store, Zuke took a quick glance around and immediately spotted Yoshihiro Kira browsing clothes by the shelves. Yoshihiro Kira looked a bit younger than in the original work, though signs of aging were still apparent. He was dressed in a somewhat worn-out suit, appearing rather ordinary. It was hard to imagine that such an unassuming tourist would be carrying a fortune that could be life-changing for a typical household. Zuke glanced at the store staff, who didn't seem interested in assisting Yoshihiro Kira. After all, he didn't look like a wealthy person. This made things easier for Zuke. If the staff had been surrounding Yoshihiro, getting close would have been inconvenient. Slowly stepping up behind Kira, Zuke took a pistol from his pocket, a gun he'd confiscated from a low-level thug. In many countries during the 1980s, the wealth gap led to social unrest, and it became common for those who lived in the shadows to possess firearms. Egypt was no exception. When facing a thug earlier, the men had pulled out this very gun to threaten Zuke, but Zuke had caught the bullet mid-air, terrifying him. The gun naturally ended up in Zuke's hands. While it didn't increase his combat power, he figured it might come in handy at some point. Like right now. "Mr. Kira, please don't make a sound. Stay quiet." Pressing the muzzle against Kira's spine, Zuke leaned close, speaking in a low, threatening voice. "You wouldn't want your spine shattered by a bullet, would you?" Indeed, the gun served as an effective tool to directly threaten Kira. If this weren't in a clothing store, Zuke could have simply used brute force, like stomping a hole in the concrete floor, a move that would certainly have frightened Kira. But here in the store, if he did that, the staff would call the police, and the ensuing investigation would draw attention from Dio's forces. So, a silent threat with a gun was the best choice. Kira, a regular person, naturally understood the power of a firearm. Wah! Kira's heart raced as he felt something cold press against his back. Although an ordinary Japanese citizen, Kira was familiar with guns from TV and magazines. The cold, cylindrical object against his back was likely a gun barrel. While it could be something else like a metal pipe, he dared not risk it being a fake. Perhaps noticing the unusual interaction between Zuke and Kira, a store clerk turned their head. "We're acquaintances, just saying hi. Don't worry about it." Zuke lied with a straight face, as if he weren't threatening Kira at all. Evidently, the staff bought it. They likely assumed that, as fellow Asians, the two must know each other. If Kira knew what the staff was thinking, he would likely curse. "All right, please come outside with me, Mr. Kira." After dismissing the clerk, Zuke gestured toward the door, signaling for Kira to leave the store with him, preparing to take him somewhere secluded. "Our position. People will notice you're threatening me once we're outside." Kira swallowed nervously, his voice trembling, trying to dissuade Zuke, fearing he'd meet an ill fate if taken away. And he was right. Walking close behind Kira in the street would indeed look suspicious. A person pressed against another from behind would draw attention. Curious officers might approach, potentially noticing Zuke holding a gun to Kira's back. True. In that case, Mr. Kira, look. Realizing this, Zuke removed the gun and casually slung an arm around Kira's shoulder, as if they were old friends. With his left arm around Kira's neck, Zuke raised his right hand, revealing a genuine gun. As Kira wondered why Zuke was showing him the gun, Zuke gripped it tightly. Crunch. The solid black metal twisted instantly, bullets spilling out onto the floor as Kira broke into a cold sweat. "Get it? If I wanted, I could twist your neck just as easily." Zuke grinned, holding Kira's shoulder like a friend. "Play along, and come quietly." Without a single shot fired, Zuke's display of strength brought even more pressure to Kira. That seemingly ordinary right hand had crushed the gun into twisted scrap. Kira had no illusions about his neck being sturdier than the gun. Now, with Zuke's arm around his shoulder, he knew one wrong move could end disastrously. And so, the two left the store together, an odd pair but less conspicuous than a direct threat. The staff inside looked at them, bewildered, as the pair left without purchasing anything. By the time they'd noticed the broken gun parts and bullets on the floor, Zuke would have already led Kira to an empty alley to strip him of all valuables. To be continued, Chapter 38, Part 4, completed. Though Zuke had anticipated that Yoshihiro Kira would carry a substantial amount of money, he was still taken aback when he found a large stash of cash in Kira's bag. "Carrying this much cash, did you just rob a bank?" As Zuke held the thick wads of cash, he couldn't help but wonder where Yoshihiro Kira could have gotten it all. After all, it was only the 1980s, mobile payment systems were nowhere close to reality, but it was unusual for someone to bring so much cash on an overseas trip. "It's just, for emergencies." Kira replied cautiously to Zuke's question, clearly intimidated by Zuke's power, and dared not resist. As Zuke had already learned, Kira's family had once been wealthy. Though they were now only left with an estate in Morio Town, they still had considerable liquid assets. Zuke vaguely recalled Yoshikage once lamenting about his family's declining fortunes, likely due to his father spending too much money on that arrow. Perhaps there was some truth to the theory of a universal correction line. Maybe Yoshikage's father had somehow sensed that this trip to Egypt would be costly, so he'd taken out all this cash. In any case, whether this was the reason or not, the money was now in Zuke's hands, and Kira couldn't possibly buy an arrow from Enya with it anymore. Enya had spent a substantial amount of money buying 5 arrows from Diavolo, and if Kira couldn't come up with the funds, she certainly wouldn't sell them cheaply to him. That old woman didn't have Dio's magnetism for attracting sinister characters. I gave you all my money, so, can I leave now? Kira, trembling, watched as Zuke counted the money, putting on a fawning smile and daring not to say a word against him, hoping Zuke would let him go once he'd finished counting. He had already made up his mind to book a ticket back to Japan as soon as he got away from this demon and vowed never to return to Egypt. As for going to the police or seeking revenge, honestly, Yoshihiro Kira had no such thought. The reason was simple: Zuke had clearly called him Mr. Yoshihiro when he pulled out his gun to threaten him. Kira remembered vividly that he had never actively told anyone his name during his time here, yet Zuke knew it. Did this mean he recognized him? Although Kira couldn't think of where he might have met Zuke, the fact that they were both Asian led him to believe Zuke might also be a resident of Morio Town. So he decided, not only would he never return to Egypt, but he'd also move away from Morio Town when he got back, just to avoid crossing paths with Zuke again. Leave. Zuke looked at Kira, sneering, and before Kira could react, he kicked him in the neck. The terrifying force snapped Kira's neck instantly. His body flew through the air, hitting the ground with eyes wide open, staring at Zuke, seemingly unable to believe that he'd attack without warning, leaving him no time to react. Kira was an unrepentant villain, so Zuke felt no need to spare him. Although he doubted Kira had the guts to go to the police, he decided to eliminate him cleanly to avoid future troubles. Had he used a bit more force or kicked just a bit higher, Zuke could have shattered Kira's head, giving him a painless death. But then, his pants, worth 20,000 yen, would have been soiled with blood and flesh, a disgusting thought. So he chose to simply break Kira's neck, letting him die slowly. Although this caused Kira a bit more suffering, it spared Zuke's pants from any unsightly mess. For someone like Kira, who did horrible things to protect his murderous son, Zuke felt no guilt for making him suffer. Go. Kira opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but he soon lost his breath. Zuke could feel his life energy diminishing until it finally dissipated completely. As for his son Yoshikage, he was probably still in Morio Town, Japan. Zuke didn't plan to go out of his way to take him down. Without his father's protection, Yoshikage likely wouldn't survive for long anyway. Zuke remembered Yoshikage killed his first victim in 1983, so Yoshikage was already a threat. However, the reason he managed to remain a serial killer undetected for decades was mainly due to the arrow his father had brought home, which awakened Yoshikage's stand, Killer Queen, giving him the ability to erase evidence and cover his tracks. Now that Yoshikage's father was dead, the arrow wouldn't make it back to Morio Town, so Yoshikage would never awaken Killer Queen. Without that powerful ability, it was only a matter of time before he got caught. Looking down at Kira's corpse, Zuke raised his hand, releasing a blast of /key that completely destroyed it, leaving no trace. With this cash, I'll be able to buy the arrow now. Zuke put the cash back in Kira's bag. He had just counted it, and there was more than enough to purchase Enya's arrow, with plenty left over. He'd been in the JoJo world for nearly 3 hours now, and with 5 hours remaining, he had enough time to buy the arrow, find a quiet place to awaken his stand, and explore its abilities. If he made quick progress, he might even storm Dio's mansion and finish the main storyline in a single day. If that happened, he could consider it a speedrun of the JoJo world's main storyline, quite a contrast to the Dragon Ball world storyline, which was still at 1%. For now, he could only hope that his stand wouldn't be some weak ability and that it would be humanoid. A humanoid stand would attach to his body and launch attacks through him. Even if it had weak stats, this kind of stand would allow him to hit his enemies directly with his own strength, enough to knock the other stands out cold. To be continued. Chapter 39, The Vision is Still Too Small. Oh. You've gathered the money this quickly. I was already prepared to wait until tomorrow. In the market, Enya greeted Zuke with a faint smile as he returned, only a bit over 2 hours since he left. She appeared harmless, like an ordinary old woman. Zuke didn't intend to expose her facade, he calmly nodded and placed a bag on the counter. It was originally Yoshihiro Kira's bag. Yes, here's the money. Feel free to count it. The bag contained exactly the amount Enya had asked for. Zuke had taken out the extra cash to buy a satchel, where he stored the rest. After all, he still needed funds to leave downtown Cairo, find a hotel, and quietly awaken his own stand. It was wise to have some backup money. Why not awaken his stand in downtown Cairo? When a stand first awakens, it can often go berserk. For instance, Jotaro Kujo's stand, Star Platinum, was uncontrollable when it first awakened, hitting random people and taking things. If Zuke's stand behaved similarly, it would be like yelling under Dio's nose, "Everyone, look! I'm a new stand user." Until he understood his stand's power, Zuke felt it was better to keep a low profile. Once his abilities were certain, he could flaunt them in front of Dio. Getting a quiet room away from the city center would help avoid detection by Dio and his subordinates, even if his stand acted up. The amount is correct. The arrow is yours. Enya didn't pretend to be generous. Like a shrewd shopkeeper, she took the cash from the bag and counted it carefully, confirming it was the correct amount. Zuke noticed that as Enya took out the wads of cash, many people around them cast greedy glances. After all, Enya looked like a frail old woman, someone who might topple over in a breeze, and she held a lot of money, naturally attracting attention. But if anyone dared to make a move on Enya, it would likely be their doom. Enya's stand, Justice, would show them what it means to be unable to live or die by their own will. However, Zuke didn't care if anyone would attempt to rob Enya or if she would take action against them. He closed the long box holding the arrow and prepared to leave. "Oh, young man, though I don't mind where you got this money from, if you ever run into trouble, feel free to find me." Enya spoke up again. Her stall still had the cash-filled bag, but she'd zipped it closed. From the outside, no one could tell how much was stuffed inside. Her words seemed loaded with meaning. Zuke's heart sank as he noticed something. On the bag of cash, there was a trace of blood. It was likely from when he kicked and broke Yoshihiro Kira's neck, and blood splattered on the bag's corner, which he hadn't noticed. Enya had, though. Clearly, she realized Zuke's money was acquired illicitly. Yet she didn't care. Enya idolized Dio, who garnered followers because he accepted and embraced their evil. As a devoted follower of Dio, Enya shared this view. So even though Zuke had obtained the money through shady means, she had no problem with it. In fact, she felt he was a perfect candidate to join Dio's ranks. "We have some influence in Cairo. We can help you resolve issues and even tell you the true use of that arrow." Enya gave him a sinister smile. Her gaze toward Zuke was now more approving. "If you're willing to pay a fee for some assistance, just come find me. I'll likely be here." Zuke didn't say much. He just nodded to Enya, then took the arrow and left, keeping his senses sharp, aware of any presence around him to prevent Enya from sending anyone to follow him. But he sensed nothing unusual as he left the market. It seemed Enya truly had no hidden scheme in selling the arrow, she simply wanted the cash. Otherwise, an ordinary person like Yoshihiro Kira wouldn't have left Egypt safely with the arrow. As for Enya's suggestion of paying for help, it likely wasn't as simple as cash. She'd probably require his stand awakening and joining Dio's ranks. Zuke would refuse. Awakening his stand only required being wounded by the arrow, nothing complex, and he didn't need Dio's help for that. And as for Enya's gaze, assuming he was already part of their circle, she was simply mistaken. Dio had some charisma, but not enough to gain his respect. In the Dragon Ball world, Zuke had seen Saiyans, beings who could destroy planets. Dio's ambition seemed unimpressive in comparison. Plus, Dio was his main mission target. There was no way he'd stand with him. As for joining Dio to be transformed into a vampire, not a chance. In the JoJo universe, vampires had little more than minor regenerative abilities and were essentially vulnerable to sunlight. With that in mind, Zuke opened his system panel and saw it had updated. Current world, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Main quest, eliminate Dio. Player's power synchronization, 10%. Please proceed with the main quest to unlock synchronization. Clearly, the system recognized obtaining the arrow as progress toward eliminating Dio, advancing the main quest, and boosting his synchronization rate to 10%. Unfortunately, Zuke still had no powers in the JoJo world yet. Unlocking synchronization now would leave him with nothing, so he needed to awaken his stand first. To be continued. Chapter 40, The Stand, Blackbird. After taking the bus back to the outskirts of Cairo, Zuke rented a room at a hotel. Sitting on the bed, he held the arrow he'd taken from the box, feeling a bit nervous. He could vaguely sense that this arrow seemed to be selecting him, which gradually eased his earlier worries. After all, awakening a stand has nothing to do with one's physical strength and is entirely dependent on innate qualifications. Even the strongest physical condition would be insufficient for a stand awakening if one lacks the necessary qualifications. However, this arrow was somewhat unique. Known as the arrow used by Yoshihiro Kira in Part 4, it automatically seeks out those with stand potential. In the plot of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 4, Yoshihiro Kira used the arrow's tracking ability to find individuals with stand potential, awakening their stands to hinder the main characters. Now, the arrow seemed to act like a weakly magnetic compass, not pointing directly at him, but still leaning toward him. This meant that the arrow acknowledged his qualifications, recognizing that he could awaken a stand. In the original story, all the arrow's targets awakened a stand, boasting a 100% success rate, so Zuke felt confident he could also awaken one. What made him nervous was the nature of his stand's ability. He wasn't expecting a time-based ability, but something like the Heaven's Door power would be nice. Let me see the power of a stand from the JoJo world. Zuke raised the arrow in his right hand and stabbed it into his left. Though according to Part 6, just pricking his finger would suffice, he felt a sense of ritual was necessary. Besides, Jolan Kujoa's stand in Part 6 wasn't very strong initially, and he wondered if it was because the wound wasn't big enough. While it might just be superstition, Zuke chose to play it safe. After all, even if he punctured his hand, his body, strengthened by ki, would heal faster than an ordinary person's and wouldn't hinder his combat ability. A moment later, the sharp blade of the arrow pierced Zuke's palm, but... clang! The blade seemed to strike a tenacious surface. Although his skin indented slightly, the arrow failed to pierce his left hand. Ah, right. I forgot to turn off my ki. Zuke was momentarily stunned, then remembered that he maintained a continuous flow of ki throughout his body to avoid oversight in Dragon Ball. In the Dragon Ball world, bodily durability relies on ki, and if one relaxes, neglecting to shield their body with ki, their durability plummets. Instances like Goku getting scratched by a bullet, knocked out by tranquilizers, or shot in the chest by Frieza's laser happened when he'd let his guard down and withdrawn his ki. Naturally, Zuke didn't want to face such a predicament. Since gaining full control over his ki, he had begun making ki protection a habit. He'd already grown accustomed to this feeling. As the ki shield didn't make his body feel like iron, it felt quite normal to the touch. But breaking through his defense wasn't so easy. Having fully acclimatized to this, he'd forgotten he still had his body shielded with ki, causing the arrow to leave no mark. This at least shows I've successfully integrated ki defense, he thought, pleased. Zuke removed the ki shield from his left hand, then infused more ki into the arrow to make it sharper, just in case the stab wasn't potent enough. The next instant, he thrust down, and his left hand was easily pierced. Pain surged from his palm as a mysterious force began to flow through the wound. Zuke knew it was likely the virus from the arrow. The arrow's stand awakening mechanism is simple. The arrowheads are crafted from extraterrestrial meteorite material and carry an alien virus that invades the body through the wound. The virus is lethal. Without sufficient qualification, a person would die from it. Those with the qualification, however, are immune to its harmful effects. Survivors, as a reward for overcoming this biological selection, awaken a stand, undergoing a transformation on both mental and spiritual levels. The virus isn't the stand itself but serves as a filtering mechanism. Through his ki perception, Zuke sensed the foreign matter invading his hand, but soon he felt the pain ease, and even the wound began to close. Observing this, Zuke understood, the virus had finished testing him. He had passed its test with hardly any pain. As the wound healed, Zuke sensed a transformation in his spirit and soul, a new force swelling within him, ready to break free, like an animal shedding its skin. Curiously, a name surfaced in his mind, as if by instinct. He whispered it with a feeling of innate recognition. Blackbird. A black shadow surged from his back, a swirling mass of darkness taking form, molding into a tall figure. Draped in a black feathered cloak, with flowing dark hair and studded black clothing, the figure was entirely cloaked in darkness, embodying Zuke's newfound power. Turning to face this imposing black figure, Zuke sensed it as an extension of his own body, controlled by his will and brimming with potent spiritual energy. So, this is my stand. Blackbird. To be continued.